In the medieval world, law was not always about guilt, and punishment was not always about justice. It was about something quieter, something deeper. It was about fear and about control. When a woman was punished in the Middle Ages, it was rarely because she had broken a universal law. Often, it was because she had broken expectation. She had spoken when silence was preferred. She had walked when stillness was safer. She had existed outside her role. Medieval society was built on layers. Men, landowners, clergy, kings, they were the visible structure. But women, they were the mortar between the stones. Present everywhere, but meant to hold things together quietly, obediently, invisibly. And so, when that silence cracked, when a woman drew attention, the system responded. Not always loudly, sometimes with a sentence written in Latin, read aloud by a trembling scribe, sometimes with a nod from a priest, sometimes with a rope. The punishments women faced were rarely about action. They were about presence, about behavior, about being seen in the wrong place or heard at the wrong time. And the tools of discipline reflected that. They didn't just break bones. They shaped the story told about a woman for the rest of her life or ended it altogether. Unlike men, who were punished for theft, for rebellion, for physical crime, women were often punished for traits, for speaking, for dressing improperly, for not submitting. These were called moral violations, but they were really just symptoms of being human in the wrong body. The church had its own role. In many places, it was the church, not the state, that decided what was moral. And since women were often seen as more temptable, more emotional, more earthly, they were watched more closely, corrected more often, and punished more harshly for things no man would be judged for. It is important to remember, many of the punishments used against women were legal, documented, approved. They weren't carried out by mobs in the dark, though those happened too. They were executed in daylight, by officials, with ritual, with approval. Some were quick, a slap, a fine, a day in stocks. Others were slower, a year in a convent, a branding iron to the cheek, a lifetime of whispers. But all of them, in one way or another, said the same thing. You are not your own. This wasn't universal, of course. The medieval world was not one flat gray place. England was not Italy. France was not Bohemia. Punishment varied by region, by custom, by ruler. But the pattern remains. The closer a woman stepped toward freedom, the more the world pulled her back with pain. Even the instruments used were specific. A man might be hanged for theft. A woman might be shaved and marched through town. One was removed, the other was remade, publicly, symbolically, with every spectator reminded. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. And what was that place? To obey, to serve, to remain modest, unseen, and silent unless spoken to avoid scandal, to carry burdens, to never, ever embarrass a man. Medieval law codes reflected this thinking. The Saxon-Spiegel in Germany allowed husbands to strike wives under certain conditions. The English common law treated women as property under the doctrine of coverture. In France, ecclesiastical courts judged women more often for moral failings than any true legal violation. Some might wonder, were there no women who resisted? There were, many, and some paid dearly. We know their names or fragments of them. We have trial records, letters, church notes. We know of women who were flogged for dancing, others who were drowned for rebellion, some who disappeared in monasteries, never to be seen again. Their stories are not all loud. Some are quiet, painfully quiet. A line in a book, a mark in a court register. Punished for improper conduct? Nothing more. But behind those short phrases lie entire lives, real voices, real pain. And it is that pain we will explore now. This journey will not be violent in its telling. We will not shout. We will not cry. We will simply walk slowly through the corridors of medieval justice. We will pause at the doors where women were silenced. We will stand in the squares where they were displayed. We will sit in the churches where they wept. And we will remember them, one punishment at a time. This is not a tale of monsters. It is a tale of ordinary power. And what that power does when it feels challenged. So lay back. Let the world fade. Let your thoughts slow. And as you fall into sleep, we will begin with the first chapter of pain. The whip, the brand, and the scar. In every medieval town square, there was a rhythm as familiar as the ringing of the market bell. The scrape of a wooden post being hauled upright, the murmur of villagers drifting toward the center, the low chant of a court clerk reciting a verdict no one really needed to hear. Whipping was not an extraordinary spectacle. It was woven into the ordinary week like bread baking or livestock bargaining, and that ordinariness is what made it such an effective weapon. To watch a woman bound to the pillory, her gown peeled low enough to bare the thin skin of her back, was to learn a lesson more persuasive than any sermon about sin. In England, the assize court spoke of moderate chastisement, yet the meaning of moderate shifted with the mood of sheriff or bailiff. A husband could petition for his wife's public whipping if she was deemed incorrigibly loud, and the law would oblige him with 10, 20, sometimes 30 strokes. A constable recorded in York, 1,378, that Alice Bennet did screech in the night, unsettling the neighbors, and was therefore tied at the post betwixt the hours of tierce and sext, whipped until blood fell. He noted, almost casually, that she was 3 months pregnant. Across the Channel, French town statutes were blunter. A first offense of prostitution merited the lash outside the city gate, a second, branding, a third, exile. Yet French officials added an element of theater by marching the condemned woman through every courtier before the first blow landed, drums beating a slow cadence so doors and shutters would open. Children stood on barrels to see better. Vendors paused mid-sale. A priest walked just behind the executioner, murmuring Latin verses that blended with the crowd's hush. In Parisian records from 1412, the phrase, "fair justice visible," appears again and again. Justice must be seen to be believed. German cities preferred precision. The Nuremberg City Council limited each strike to the breadth of a man's hand from the last, and employed professional scharfrichter trained to leave livid stripes without tearing muscle. They worked like artisans, priding themselves on clean, even welts that would heal into unmistakable scars, badges of warning any passerby could read. A traveler from Lübeck described watching a woman named Greta Witt flogged for mocking her husband before witnesses. He counted 25 lashes, each placed with mathematical care. Afterward, Greta was forced to stand upright so the crowd could catalog the pattern. He wrote, "Her silence at the end was more terrible than her cries at the start." In the warmer South, the climate itself became part of the punishment. Italian communes scheduled whippings at the height of midday sun, when stone piazzas radiated heat and the iron manacles scalded wrists before the whip even rose. Vinegar, or brine, was often splashed across broken skin, both as disinfectant and as agony, prolonged. A 1,324 Florentine ordinance insisted this was an act of mercy better, to cleanse wounds now than court infection later, but victims recalled the sting long after stripes faded. Benedetta de Luca, flogged for adultery, testified years afterwards that the smell of vinegar in summer could still bend her knees. Though the mechanics differed, the purpose was uniform. The body of a woman was a message board on which authority wrote its warning. In Cologne, a chronicler notes how townsfolk were encouraged to approach between strokes, to study the expression of pain, to let the image settle in memory like wax beneath a seal. In Castile, a similar ritual existed. Spectators were invited to recite aloud the condemned woman's sin thief, fornicator, witch, so the word would linger in air with each whistle of leather. Shame was not an after effect, it was the main ingredient. Not every sentence ended with blood. Some officials favored the half punishment, display without lashing. A woman might be tied but untouched, her crime proclaimed while the whip dangled, unused a reprieve granted if she wept convincingly or recited a public confession. Yet this mercy carried its own cruelty, for the gathered crowd arrived hungry for spectacle. Disappointment curdled into mockery. English diarist Thomas Walsingham described one 1,383 scene where a spared laundress was pelted with offal because the people felt cheated of their due portion of pain. The whip was absent, but humiliation achieved its goal. Occasionally, the spectacle turned inward, conducted behind cloister walls rather than before an audience. In Cistercian nunneries of Burgundy, sisters guilty of minor disobedience knelt shirtless in the chapter house to receive measured strokes from the abbess's rod. No onlookers, no shouting, only the echo of wood on skin and the scratch of quills as the discipline was logged. External crowds were unnecessary. The community itself supplied witness and memory. For the nun, every chapel bell thereafter might recall the cadence of the rod. Yet whether witnessed by thousands or by no one at all, the public whip left predictable footprints. Backs scarred into ridges that stiffened in winter cold, shoulders that flinched at any sudden sound resembling hiss of rope. Voices fall into whispers, for fear a wrong word would summon leather once more. It taught women to hold their tongues, to lower their gaze, to police one another lest a friend's recklessness bring collective disgrace. And it taught children girls especial that their future skins were bargaining chips. Behave and keep them smooth, rebel and carry the map of punishment forever. Travelers' journals, ecclesiastical court rolls, even royal chronicles repeat the same quiet logic. Pain delivered in daylight is pain multiplied. It pierces not only the one who bleeds, but every witness who imagines herself in that place. Thus, the whip became a silent pedagogue, instructing generation after generation in the virtues of obedience. And because its lesson was carved in flesh, it could not be easily erased. Not by time, not by mercy, not by the faint hope of forgetting. When evening came and the market stalls closed, the post still stood in the square, darkened with drying blood, catching the last light like a crimson thread. Mothers hurried daughters past it without speaking. Somewhere a clerk sharpened quills to record the next sentence. Somewhere a leatherworker checked the knots on a fresh lash, ensuring they were tight, supple, ready. And in quiet houses, women traced fingertip over hidden scars, counting, remembering, surviving. In many towns, a woman did not need to raise a weapon to be feared. Her voice alone could rattle the walls of custom. For that offense speaking too sharply, too cleverly, or too often iron was shaped into silence. The device was called by many names: the scold's bridle in England, the branks in Scotland, la bride de garce in parts of France. Always, it began as a strip of blacksmith's work, hammered thin, curved like a horse's bit, then widened into a lattice that cupped the face. Slots for eyes, slits for breath, and in the center a flat tongue plate that slid past the teeth. Some plates were smooth. Others were studded with spikes, so a single syllable would tear flesh and draw blood that tasted of iron and regret. Records from Perth describe merchants paying the town smith for one helmet contrived to quiet a woman of quarrelsome nature. The cost was minor. The humiliation was priceless. On market days, the bridle was padlocked behind a woman's head and a chain fixed to the pillory. She could stand, she could breathe, and the crowd could admire their tidy solution, a living effigy of silence. Children tossed pebbles, vendors jeered, and any attempt at protest rattled metal against teeth until the mouth filled with the copper sting of her own voice. Not every town required a public square. In smaller English parishes, the bridle hung on the church porch beside the poor box. It was considered a tool of charity better, the vicar said, to gag one sharp tongue than let strife spread through households like rot in a granary. Wives were marched after Sunday service to kneel while the key turned in the lock, the sermon of discipline delivered not from the pulpit, but from the iron biting their lips. Minutes slid into hours while psalms echoed overhead, and when the key finally scraped open again, the women's faces bore the white imprint of metal bars, a temporary tattoo of obedience that lingered for days. Germany favored a subtler variant, the Ketzer mask, or heretic's mask, molded into grotesque expressions a pig's snout, a devil's grin. A woman condemned for gossip in Augsburg might be forced to wear such a mask during errands, her real features erased beneath painted ridicule. She carried her own shame like a lantern, illuminating every alley she passed. One chronicler writes of Magdalena Hurt, who sold eggs with the snout mask strapped tight. Buyers joked that the mask suited her trade, and she, unable to remove it without heavy fines, learned to speak only with her eyes. In the Low Countries, the punishment grew mobile. Instead of chaining the wearer in place, officials attached a bell to the iron crown, so each step announced her presence. A ringing woman became a wandering warning. This is what happens when speech grows unruly. The sound drifted ahead of her like ripples on water. Shutters closed, dogs barked, and even those who pitied her kept distance, as though the clapper might knock against their own throats next. Occasionally, the bridle traveled across an ocean. In 17th century Virginia, a Scottish magistrate carried one aboard ship to the colonies, insisting the New World required old discipline. Plantation records show indentured women locked into the device for brawling in the fields or improper mirth after sunset. The humid air rusted the iron faster than in Scotland, so blacksmiths greased the hinges with tallow rendered from hogs. The smell clung to hair and skin. Long after the bridle was removed, The rancid sweetness lingered, marking its former wearer as surely as any scar. Medical notes survived too. Jaws that froze half open, tongues infected where spikes pressed, teeth loosened by constant pressure. Yet the most lasting wound was quieter. A midwife in Durham recorded treating a woman who had worn the bridle only once and thereafter could not speak above a whisper, not because her tongue failed, but because her mind anticipated pain with every word. Silence became a self-imposed bridle, lighter than iron, impossible to unlock. The devices did not always require law. Some husbands commissioned private bridles for household use, small enough to hide in a chest, ornate enough to display mastery when guests inquired. One surviving example from Kent is engraved with vines and two tiny birds mocking decoration on an object designed to kill song. Scholars argue whether such domestic bridles were legal. The point is moot. They existed, and the women who wore them became footnotes in no ledger but their own memories. Yet even iron grows tired. By the late 17th century, civic use of the bridle waned. Officials called it archaic, towns found new spectacles, and the masks were relegated to museum cases or armory dust. But the impulse remained. Words could still threaten, silence was still prized. And though mouths were no longer locked in steel, they learned new ways to stay shut through rumor, through shame, through the echo of ancestral clapper hitting ancestral teeth. Somewhere, in an attic of a forgotten guild hall, a rusted cage lies folded, hinges stiff with centuries. The spike on its tongue plate is dull now, yet it retains a memory of metal on skin, of breath funneled through narrow slits, of entire towns pausing to admire the stillness it enforced. The silence it demanded did not end when the lock turned open. It merely stepped from iron into habit, from habit into tradition, and from tradition into the quiet spaces where speech dares not wander. Fire was described no one could refuse. A hot iron, pressed once against living skin, wrote a sentence that never faded, never blurred, never silenced its own testimony. For women in the Middle Ages, branding performed two tasks at once. It punished the flesh in a moment of searing pain and then carried the memory outward, visible on cheeks, palms, or shoulders long after the wound closed. The scar spoke in every marketplace and church porch, retelling the crime even when the woman tried her hardest not to. In the French city of Rouen, municipal rolls list more than 100 women branded between 1,350 and 1,450. Their offenses range from street corner prostitution to dishonest games of dice played after curfew, but the punishment was remarkably uniform. An iron shaped like the fleur de lis, heated in a charcoal brazier until white orange. Applied to the left cheek for the time, it took a clerk to recite the Ave Mariano quicker, no slower. Witnesses describe a smell like singed parchment. Some women fainted before the prayer ended. Others stood rigid, eyes fixed on the sky, unwilling to give the crowd the relief of collapse. Across the channel, the English preferred letters to symbols. A woman condemned for petty theft might carry a bold T on the palm, burned deep enough that the shape rose in glossy scar tissue. For adultery, the mark was A, placed just above the breastbone where any neckline, however modest, failed to conceal it. One London alderman defended the practice, arguing that branding was merciful. The skin heals, the soul remembers, but the branded themselves reported a different mercy. Difficulty finding a husband, beggars, refusing to share corners, barbers doubling their price to shave a face marred by royal authority. Germany added cold logic to the flame. In Lübeck, the council decreed that branding should be applied at dawn beside the salt quay, so the sea wind might harden the woman and cauterize the sin. A bucket of brine waited to plunge the iron afterward, sending up a hiss loud enough to turn sailors' heads. The same brine was then splashed across the wound, salt crystals settling into raw dermis and ensuring the scar swelled high and pale like chalk on red brick. Some physicians warned the practice risked blood poisoning. The council replied that any soul punished by law was already infected. Branded women developed survival habits. They learned to carry baskets, shawls, anything that could be positioned to obscure the mark. They chose routes through town that kept the scar turned toward alley walls. One Paris midwife wore a veil for 40 years, even in summer heat, claiming it guarded her lungs. The real reason was the crescendo-shaped burn left over from a charge of illegal fortune-telling in her youth. Yet concealment worked only part of the time. Markets bustled, accidents exposed skin, gossips tugged veils. The scar resumed its speech. Occasionally, branding traveled beyond punishment into commerce. A Florentine guild of brothel keepers in the late 14th century required new recruits to display a small branded rose on the inner forearm, proof of taxes paid, protection fees settled. The city quietly tolerated the arrangement. A branded worker could be traced, regulated, fined. Freedom was messier. Thus, the irony: a woman might flee branding as punishment only to accept it voluntarily as license to survive. Religious institutions left their own signature. Cistercian records from Dijon detail the branding of nuns accused of breaking enclosure. The mark, a tiny cross on the shoulder blade, remained hidden beneath wool habits, unseen by the public, yet omnipresent to the sister herself each time cloth brushed the ridged skin. Confessors described it as a private sermon the body preached to the soul. In practice, it forced obedience through constant physical memory. Bend to pray, feel the tug of scar, raise arms and chant, feel it stretch, lie awake at night, feel it pulse with weather shifts and age. When branding irons crossed the Atlantic with Spanish colonists, they adapted to new surroundings. In Mexico, city-town guards carried small handheld markers shaped like M and C pressed behind a woman's ear if she was caught selling chiles without a license. The rationale echoed Europe: identify, deter, shame, but the heat of the New World sun meant many wounds festered. Some women died of infection weeks later, their initial crime forgotten, their death unrecorded except as a caution whispered in the plaza. Even kings could not escape the language of brands. English statutes note that during Henry VIII's reign, counterfeiters, men and women alike, were branded on the cheek with S for seditious. Yet the comments that survived from the period focused disproportionately on women's faces, describing ruined beauty, lost marriage prospects, children frightened by their mothers. A male counterfeit might be feared. A female was pitied, mocked, or quietly erased from invitations to feast days and harvest dances. Attempts to soften the practice arose sporadically. A physician in Utrecht proposed using ink instead of fire, tattooing the letter to reduce infection. The council rejected his idea, declaring that a scarless mark failed to warn the heart against future sin. Another reformer in Venice suggested fines in place of brands for first offenses, only to be reminded that poor women could not pay fines, and the state would lose its visible deterrent. Reform, like water on a hot iron, hissed and vanished. Yet scars age. Skin stretches, fades, puckers. A 60-year-old cheek brand becomes a blurred island in a sea of wrinkles. The original shape bends until observers argue whether the woman sold her body or stole a hen half a century before. In this decay, some women found small refuge. Time erased certainty. An Amsterdam widow mocked her own fading ponce, bright proof of prostitution, telling neighbors it now stood for prayer. They laughed, but they could not prove her wrong. When the past distorts, the brand loses part of its grip. Still, late at night, fingers trace the outline. Scar tissue feels colder than surrounding flesh, less pliant, more present. A brand is a permanent interruption, a memory that refuses the comfort of forgetting. It outlives the accuser, the magistrate, the scribe. It outlives every witness except the one who bears it. And even when she finally closes her eyes, the mark remains on the bone, silent testimony to a single moment when fire turned law into flesh. Water, so often a symbol of life, turned cold and accusatory when medieval justice sought answers it could not see. For women, the surface of a pond or river became a mirror that judged innocence by buoyancy, guilt by the weight of a drenched dress. No courtroom oath or parchment verdict carried such theatrical certainty as the splash of a body bound at wrist and ankle, lowered from a ladder, released to the mercy of currents and superstition. In English boroughs, the ducking stool offered a more deliberate rhythm of punishment. It resembled a seesaw fixed beside a mill pond, a stout beam, a slingback chair at one end, a counterweight at the other. The condemned woman, lashed to the seat, dangled above the water while constables recited her offenses: colding, brawling, selling ale with a false measure. On cue, the beam tilted, the chair plunged, bubbles blossomed, then back up, dripping, gasping, to face jeers before the next descent. Town statutes limited dunkings to 3, yet eyewitnesses wrote of 5, 6, even 9 immersions on festive days when the crowd demanded spectacle. A diarist in Norwich noted how children counted aloud, 1, 2, 3, as though learning arithmetic by breaths a woman could not take. Scotland adopted the English stool but set it against the sea. In fishing villages, the condemned were swung out over tidal pools where salt water stung eyes and lips raw. The North Sea wind cut through woolen bodices, chilling flesh faster than the water itself. So punishment doubled as exposure. Parish minutes from Fife record one Margaret Mill decried for clamorous gossip. During her ducking, the rope snagged, holding her half submerged while waves slapped her face. The scribe wrote, "She suffered 3 tides in one turning." How long that turning lasted, he did not say. On the continent, trial by water blended with older rituals of ordeal. In the Holy Roman Empire, a woman accused of theft or sorcery might undergo the Wasserprobe, wrists bound crosswise, rope looping beneath the knees. She was dropped into a village pond. The verdict depended on whether she sank. If water welcomed her, innocence was presumed, and men hauled her up quickly, though records admit that more than one innocent woman never resurfaced in time. If she floated, buoyed by trapped air and clothing, guilt was declared. Punishment followed: fine, flogging, or the stake, each justified by the water's testimony. France applied a variation during witchcraft panics. The so-called épreuve froide required suspects to stand barefoot in a tub while clerics poured ladles of river water over their heads, chanting psalms. If the woman shivered uncontrollably, it was a sign her body rejected holy elements, proof of hidden sin. If she remained calm, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer, skeptics said the devil lent her composure. Either result tilted toward condemnation, the ordeal merely adorned the inevitable with ritual dampness. Across the Atlantic, English practices migrated to Puritan settlements. In Massachusetts, ducking chairs perched beside still ponds fringed by pine. The colonial twist lay in timing. Dunkings occurred at dawn, before mist lifted, so neighbors awoke to distant splashes and muffled prayers floating through fog. Cotton Mather, recording one such event, remarked that early light showed the sinner's breath like white ghosts fleeing the mouth. The poetic image masked a harsher truth. Cold dawn water induced shock faster, tightening chests, stealing breath before voices could protest. Yet water punishments were not confined to formal devices. In German territories, millers' wives sometimes administered their own justice to newcomers, accused of adultery, binding the woman with flax cords, rolling her into a stream, pelting her with wet laundry as makeshift stones. Authorities often looked away. The communal nature of the act absolved individuals of blame. The stream washed evidence downstream, and gossip carried memory in its place. Natural conditions shaped outcomes. In summer, stagnant ponds grew warm and thick with algae, causing women to float more Redillian, unfortunate omen of presumed guilt. Winter thaw turned riverbanks to mud. Rescuers trudged slowly, so a sinking woman risked drowning before innocence could be declared. A Bavarian chronicle recounts a February Wasserprobe, where ice floes bunched around the accused, forming a small white prison she could not break. She was pulled free unconscious, acquitted by sinking, but succumbed to frostbite days later. Medical treatises of the period warned of water fever, a lung inflammation that followed sudden immersion, yet courts rarely heeded such advice. Surgeons patched wounds, priests absolved souls, magistrates preserved precedent. What mattered was the public affirmation that water, God's element, could not leaven if bodies did. Like all punishments, these ordeals bred economies. Carpenters built stools, rope makers twisted bindings, blacksmiths forged hinges that resisted rust. In Holland, whole families gathered eelgrasses from riverbanks to pad the ducking chair's seat, sold as mercy mats at a tidy profit. Such comforts offered only irony. A softer seat did not soften the plunge. Women developed their own preparations. Some wrapped hair in tight braids to trap pockets of air, hoping to sink decisively. Others layered petticoats with stones sewn into hems. Rumors spread of witches rubbing skin with goose fat to repel water. Magistrates ordered pre-dunking searches, turning humiliation into nudity, nudity into further shame. Yet, water can be fickle. One Devon register tells of Anne Furse, accused of poisoning cattle, who floated despite lead weights hidden in her sleeves. Spectators cried proof of sorcery. Much later, physicians suggested natural buoyancy was slight, her lung capacity large. But reason seldom rescues reputations already drowned. Every punishment ended the same way: wet fabric clinging to skin, jaws chattering, eyes avoiding the crowd that moments before reveled in each splash. Some women were led home, blankets draped like insufficient apologies. Others shuffled to jail cells where damp clothes steamed in straw-smelling dark. No verdict restored warmth to bone. The chill claimed its own sentence, lingering in joints, fluttering through lungs on rainy nights, summoning nightmares of green water closing overhead. The ducking stools rotted eventually. Wood warped, iron pins loosened, ponds were drained to make room for warehouses and shaded promenades. But somewhere beneath carefully laid cobblestones, the mud still remembers the thrash of skirts, the muffled scream swallowed by a ripple, the silence when bubbles ceased. Rain gathers in hollows, glistens, evaporates, begins again. The cycle repeats long after justice has forgotten the names it once lowered into the deep. Hair, in the Middle Ages, was more than ornament. It was lineage in strands, piety in braids. Modesty slipped across shoulders like a veil no loom could weave. To strip it away was to peel the skin of identity without shedding blood, a punishment that traveled easily from bishop's decree to marketplace gossip because it required no scaffold, no rope, no ironically shears, and a public eye. Across Christendom, the sound of scissors closing over women's heads carried a hush heavier than any crack of whip. People understood instinctively that the blade clipping through hair was carving through honor itself. In Flanders, city ordinances spoke of Sharon ter Shand, shaving for shame applied to adulteresses, thieves of linen, and wives who berated husbands before witnesses. The ritual unfolded at dawn near the cloth hall. A bench, a single candle to steady the barber's hand, a clerk reading the charge. Locks were severed first in handfuls, then scraped to the scalp with a razor dipped into vinegar so the skin burned, ensuring redness that would linger days after stubble sprouted. When the barber finished, he lifted the hair and tossed it to waiting boys, who scattered it through streets like confetti distorted by malice. The woman, now berescolled and trembling in the wind, was told to sweep the hall steps as penance each downward stroke of broom, reminding spectators of the upward flick of shears moments before. England practiced its own version under the heading of divestiture of crowning glory. Church courts in Canterbury disciplined fornication by ordering nuns to crop hair to 2 finger breadths, but for laywomen, the cut could be absolute. Accounts from 1,315 describe Eleanor Blythe, convicted of deceitful selling of dyed silk, marched around the city with half her head shaved, the remaining hair left hanging in tangled humiliation. The asymmetry mattered. A whole shave evoked nun-like humility, but a half-shave broadcast disorder, as though the body itself could not decide its allegiance to virtue or vanity. France entwined shaving with procession. Along the Seine, officials led condemned women across bridges, crowded with fishmongers and pilgrims, the city's cathedral bells marking each snip. A priest walked ahead swinging incense, sanctifying the act so onlookers could label the spectacle holy rather than cruel. One chronicler, Guillaume de Sens, noted that as the procession moved, river gulls circled overhead, snatching floating wisps of hair that drifted on the brisoments. People whispered that the soul's protection had flown as well. Spain layered symbolism further by pairing head shaving with dress inversion. Punished women wore their chemises inside out so seams and stitching showed proof of turned fortune. After the shave, they were paraded past the local bathhouse, a deliberate iron stripped of hair yet denied cleansing. The gesture suggested moral filth that no water could rinse, a stain visible only once the protective curtain of curls had been cut away. In the German lands, some cities prescribed Schandkappen, coney-shaped hats slapped onto newly exposed skulls. Painted bright yellow or vermilion, the hat whistled slightly in wind, forcing the wearer's posture upright lest it tumble. Children delighted in chasing the cone, flicking pebbles against it to hear dull thuds. A Nuremberg directive ordered the woman to keep the cap for 40 days. If it was lost or destroyed, lashes followed. Thus, humiliation morphed into ongoing vigilance. The cap, a fragile relic of disgrace, the punished must guard. Across the Mediterranean, Italian communes believed hair retained spiritual heat. Shaving was thought to expose a woman to cold humors, drawing melancholy into bone. Physicians wrote recipes of warming tonic cinnamon, myrrh, goat's milk to counter the chill. Yet civic records make clear such cures were rarely distributed. Sorrow served the sentence well. A widow in Siena, punished for public swearing, later recounted that winter winds sang through the chambers of my skull, and no hearth could mute the song. Not every shaving took place at civic command. Husbands, emboldened by custom, sometimes performed the act at home. Court filings from York record Agnes Carter suing for divorce after her spouse sheared her head while she slept, claiming it would level her pride. Though judges condemned the brutality, they cited no statute against the practice. Hair, they implied, lay within marital jurisdiction. The suit failed, Agnes returned, and neighbors learned a fresh boundary. A man's shears were as potent as any alderman's decree. Colonial America inherited the ritual in wartime. During the Revolutionary conflict, women suspected of loyalist sympathies were shorn by patriot mobson, echo of medieval shame, crossing oceans with English common law. Witness Sarah Frost wrote that after the cut, the scalp shone white in moonlight, a lantern for mockers to follow. No magistrate ordered the act, yet no militia officer intervened. The crowd's justice borrowed legitimacy from centuries of precedent. Religious minorities added their own layers. Among certain Anabaptist sects, voluntary head shaving signaled penitence, so involuntary shaving blurred lines between atonement and coercion. When authorities punished a wayward Anabaptist woman by cropping her hair, she could later move among believers, claiming spiritual rebirth rather than state-imposed shame. Wealthy cities countered by shaving asymmetrically or branding initials atop the bare crown, complicating any attempt at reclaiming narrative. Hair grew back. Shame intended it would not. Yet some women wielded regrowth as quiet rebellion. They nurtured strands with walnut oil, braided infant fuzz with ribbons, wove wreaths from cloth to mimic vanished volume. In Amsterdam, a baker's wife asked her husband to shave his head in solidarity, and he did. Townsfolk laughed, but could not mock a matching pair without mocking matrimony itself. Solidarity dulled disgrace, though not every husband proved so daring. Clergy occasionally wrestled with the sacramental impact of enforced shaving. If a woman's hair was her covering before God, did stripping it away expose her to sin or cleanse her vanity? Debates filled parchment margins, but practice marched on. Scissors clicked, locks fell, theology trailed behind. One Franciscan friar resolved the issue by offering freshly shorn women small linen veils. City treasuries balked at the cost, and the gesture faded. With time, laws softened, though customs lingered. By the 18th century, many cities commuted hair penalties to fines, yet folk justice still seized scissors when rumor ran hot. Village squares that once rang with whip cracks now rustled with hair fluttering under shears, a quieter cruelty, but a cruelty all the same. Even centuries later, a shaving can echo. Photographs from liberated France in 1944 capture women, accused of collaboration heads stripped bald, swastikas painted on skin, crowds mocking what history had taught them to fear. The method outlived monarchy, church, and empire because hair remained shorthand for dignity. Remove it, and dignity seemed to drift away like dust. A lock severed retains no memory of the body, but the body remembers the lock. Cool night air on bare scalp startles awake at odd hours. Fingers reach for absent tresses long after they return. A mirror reflects not length, but the day it was lost. Thus the punishment thickens in recollection, a braid of humiliation, isolation, and slow regrowth that never quite weaves into what once was. Nothing unsettled medieval onlookers more than a fully revealed body, not because they lacked familiarity with skin fields, birth rooms, plague pits offered constant reminder of mortality, but because nakedness torn from the private realm became a theater of deliberate power. To strip a woman in public was to proclaim she had forfeited every layer of protection: cloth, modesty, reputation, even the right to winter warmth. Clothes defined station, removal erased it. Within minutes, a merchant's wife, a midwife, a miller's daughter all looked the same flesh, blushing under chill air, goosebumps standing like braille that spelled disgrace. Spanish chronicles record desnudez de pena, nudity of penalty applied to blasphemers and women of proud step. In Seville, the condemned were led at sunrise through narrow lanes, shoulders brushed by balconies, where neighbors leaned out to offer pious gasps. Officials allowed a thin cord around the waist, ostensibly to guide the prisoner, but in truth to emphasize what was missing: fabric, belt, any emblem of social belonging. Witnesses described the swish of that cord against thighs as louder than the murmured prayers trailing her progress. At journey's end, a courtyard basin awaited. A bucket of cold water dashed across her chest, served both cleansing and spectacle, droplets catching dawn like jewels no dowry could redeem. Italy favored symbolism layered atop exposure. In Florence, women convicted of adultery or false testimony were marched barefoot over hot paving stones in midsummer, skin softening under heat until each step left a dark footprint that evaporated slowly behind her. Bystanders likened it to a sin visibly steaming away, though the woman, teeth gritted, knew the steam was her own sweat, her own pain, her own sin rising to join cathedral incense drifting overhead. Northern Europe introduced seasonal cruelty. In Lübeck, officials scheduled naked penance for the first frost when river winds sliced through harbor streets. The condemned received a single wooden spoon to carry symbol of domestic duty, yet the utensil offered no warmth, only a useless reminder of tasks she would not perform that day. One ledger entry notes Helka Bauer, punished for market fraud, forced to hold the spoon outstretched until her arm shook. Citizens were invited to spit into it, spittle freezing into cloudy pearls before slipping down the handle. Helka's nails turned violet. Still, the bailiff urged her not to drop the spoon, lest extra hours be added. In the Low Countries, exposure often mingled with sound. A woman stripped for gossip might walk behind a fiddler, sawing discordant notes so sharp they seemed to slice the air around her body. The music declared her presence long before she appeared, ensuring crowds thickened in advance, eyes primed for scandal. Afterward, silence felt heavier than before, for even the absence of melody reminded everyone what had played. England employed darkness instead of daylight. Certain villages along the Thames marched naked offenders by lantern light, the body illuminated in flickers that revealed, concealed, revealed again an echo of spiritual uncertainty. Thomas Fuller wrote that villagers watched as moths to a taper, curiosity burning their consciences thin. Rain frequently accompanied these penances. Wet skin reflected lantern glow until each drop glittered like a tiny confession sliding down ribs. Naked punishments sometimes shared space with religious feasts, a collision of piety and humiliation. On Corpus Christi in Valencia, 2 women condemned for carnal excess processed behind clergy carrying the host. They walked the same stones as monks in embroidered copes, yet the gulf between flesh and brocade stretched wider than any nave. A Dominican chronicler justified the juxtaposition. Their shame adorns his glory. He omitted how children watching learned to equate bare female bodies with sacrificial offerings. Not all stripping occurred in streets. Some unfolded on thresholds of home. In Burgundy, a husband could petition local court for the right to disrobe a wayward wife and push her across the family threshold on foot inside. 1 foot out while neighbors gathered to witness the suspension between belonging and exile. The ritual ended when she begged forgiveness or when dusk fell, whichever arrived first. Those who held out until darkness risked cold night air, vermin, and the harsher judgment of dawn's return. Taverns profited as unofficial viewing boxes. Brewers placed benches near common routes of exposure, charging for ale and vantage. One Antwerp publican offered confession cups. Patrons paid extra to shout advice or scripture as the woman passed. City officials condemned the practice publicly, yet taxed the resulting sales. Civic virtue bowed to commerce, as it so often did. Women, knowing exposure might lurk behind any accusation, devised strategies. Shirts stitched with hidden drawstrings would drop but tangle, preserving a shred of modesty. Braids wrapped around breasts, masked nipples from direct view. Mud darkened limbs, turning curves into ambiguous silhouettes under poor lighting. Some bribed turnkeys for scraps of cloth. Others invoked pregnancy, hoping officials balked at shaming an unborn child. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the child, too, inherited the penalty, naked in mother's arms as she walked. Theologians argued over the soul's stance during forced exposure. Did involuntary nakedness strip spiritual as well as social covering? Augustinian scholars cited Genesis, Eve's sudden shame. Franciscans countered with Job, naked yet righteous. Meanwhile, the punished offered their own exegesis, trembling flesh, chattering teeth, downcast eyes. Their scripture was weather and witness, their verses footprints cooling on stone. Occasionally, exposure became fatal. A Geneva case from 1,482 recounts a woman left overnight on a bridge, chained, unclothed. As winter fog thickened, guards found her at dawn, skin glazed in rime, eyelashes frozen shut. The council lamented her death, fined the watchman for neglect, but upheld the sentence as lawful. Frost, like rope or rod, was simply another tool. Centuries later, echoes surfaced again. In revolutionary France, female prisoners were paraded half-naked to the guillotine. In occupied Europe, shaved collaborators were marched in slips torn to the waist. Each era discovered anew the potency of unveiled flesh as public proclamation of guilt. Modernity provided cameras instead of clerks, yet the principle endured. Spectacle demands skin. The body eventually reclothes, but memory does not. Even after fabrics settle, the phantom of cold air lingers, a chill that no hearth cures completely. Cicatrices form where rope bit wrists, abrasions where cobblestones scrape knees. Yet the deepest mark is invisible, the imprint left by thousands of eyes tallying every inch. A gaze that follows home, slips under door, hides in wash basin reflections. Garments stitched after punishment never quite close that doorway. They drape over experience the way curtains dim but cannot erase the view outside. A swelling belly should have announced new life, yet in much of medieval Europe it could signal judgment ready to descend. When an unmarried woman began to show, neighbors counted months against wedding dates, and math sharpened into accusation. The law, eager to guard lineage and property, treated illegitimate pregnancy as both moral lapse and economic threat. A child without a lawful father might someday claim bread from parish alms or contest inheritance in court. So, before the infant first cried, its mother often cried in the town hall, under oath, beneath the steady gaze of men who weighed her shame against civic order. In England, church courts convened sessions called the Court of Correction, where midwives and matrons examined expectant bodies for signs not of health but of illicit conception. If a woman refused naming the father, she faced fines beyond any purse she likely possessed. Failure to pay shifted penalty to the body. Public penance in linen smock, hair unbound, candle clutched in trembling hands as she circled the church 3 times on Sunday, congregation murmuring prayers that fell between pity and scorn. Should the child die before baptisms, the all-out common outcome of poverty or concealed birth, the mother risked accusation of infanticide, a capital crime. Thus, every contraction carried double terror, pain of labor, fear of law. German territories codified kinsmord, child murder into city statutes. A woman delivering a loan in secret was presumed guilty if the newborn did not survive, regardless of circumstance. Records from Nuremberg list verdicts rendered after neighbors, hearing no infant screams, summoned constables. A blood-stained straw mattress, a hastily dug garden pit, sufficed as proof. Punishment often meant burial alive, the mother placed in a sack with the lifeless child, lowered beneath gallows where carrion birds perched. Chroniclers noted the ritual without comment, as though earth itself sealed both bodies and scandal in one motion. France pursued a different path by anchoring regulation to midwives. Royal ordinances required every midwife to register births within 24 hours, naming father if present, marking illegitimate if absent. Failure invited loss of license, imprisonment, even branding with the word faiseuse d'ange, angel maker. Some midwives forged father names real. Imagined, deceased to spare women harsher fates. Their quiet forgeries stitched compassion into bureaucracy, though risked their own ruin if discovered. In Scandinavian regions, folk custom met canon law. A pregnant maiden underwent seat of confession, kneeling on a rough ash block before priests and elders until she disclosed the man's identity. If she remained silent, the block remained too. Following her to home and market, a heavy stool she was forced to carry as seat and burden until birth. Villagers called it the Shambu bench. Children chalked insults across its plank sides. Each new word, another tightening of social ligature. Punishment extended beyond mother to midwife and child. Swabian codes fined midwives who failed to report suspected concealment. Some towns confiscated their birthing stools as collateral, rendering them unable to work a sentence, rippling outward as other women labored unattended. Illegitimate children, once grown, paid a lifelong tax known as current shilling, a coin dropped yearly into parish chests to remind community of their origins. Yet, cruelty found nuance. English poor law administrators calculated that whipping a single mother in public might spark charity among onlookers, reducing burden on parish funds. Thus, penance sometimes served economic as well as moral aims. A widow of Bedfordshire, lashed for bearing a child with her tenant, received more loaves in alms afterward than before. The vestry recorded the outcome with satisfaction, having shifted costs from budget to populace. Village gossip could rival any statute. In alpine hamlets where court sat distant, rumor acted as summons. A maiden mocked for widening waist might flee to forest huts, birthing alone, hoping to return once shape slimmed. Some never returned, adrift between fear of wolves and fear of gallows. Their absence became cautionary tale told by hearth fires, stray from virtue, and vanish like smoke into pine shadows. One might ask, what of the fathers? In many jurisdictions, their guilt dissipated amid uncertainty. Swelling flesh betrayed them. Some acknowledged paternity under pressure, paying token fines. Others claimed impotence or accused women of promiscuity. In courts, starved for paternity tests, often believed them. In London, a brewer's apprentice escaped penalty by swearing he lay with the woman. Beneath full moon, when witchcraft clouds men's senses, shifting blame to her supposed sorcery. She, already sentenced to stocks, now faced witchcraft suspicion atop fornication. Church ritual could soften edges, but not erase them. Priests baptized illegitimate infants in side chapels, candles few, sponsors scarce. The font water was the same, yet the prayers carried whispered qualifiers born of frailty, brought forth from error. Mothers watched, clutching coarse cloth around shoulders, while parish matrons eyed them like potters judging cracked vessels. Across the Mediterranean, Italian dowry culture transformed pregnancy into financial disaster. A dishonored daughter forced parents to refund dowry promises or forfeit advantageous matches for siblings. Families sometimes cloistered pregnant girls in countryside villas, bribing midwives to deliver in secrecy, baptizing the newborn days later under a servant's name. If rumors leaked, the girl entered convent life permanently, veiled not by faith alone but by economic necessity. Eastern Orthodox lands wove penance into liturgy. Unwed mothers barred from communion for set years 3, 5, 7, depending on episcopal mercy. They stood at church entrance, while others approached altar, receiving only priestly blessing through threshold air. Some left offerings of swaddling cloth embroidered with tears, tokens of sorrow laid beside icons of mother and child, hoping compassion might flow backward through painted gold. The Black Death altered patterns briefly. Surplus graves, broken kin networks, and shifting labor needs made bastardy less scandalous in some towns. Manpower mattered more than morals. Yet, as population stabilized, censure returned with vigor, as though society feared chaos might rise again from unregulated wombs. Medical treatises betrayed bias masked as science. Physicians claimed illegitimate pregnancies produced weaker offspring, citing soul's turmoil crossing placenta. One Paris doctor prescribed potions of rue and vinegar to strengthen shame-weakened infants, inadvertently offering abortifacients. Some mothers used to end pregnancies rather than face courts. Authorities condemned the practice, yet demand persisted in shadowed apothecary corners. Punishment sometimes inverted. Cities like Lübeck offered leniency if the mother named the father, enabling prosecution of men for seduction. Yet naming risked violent reprisal. A recorded case shows Greta von Danzig beaten to death by the man she cited, his crime afterward downgraded to manslaughter in heat of restitution. Justice balanced precariously between confession and survival. Through it all, the unborn remained silent witnesses. Some entered world under stigma, others never breathed outside womb's refuge. Yet their presence shaped walls of law, architecture of fear, rhythms of whispered speculation in bakeries, wells, weaving rooms. Each hidden kick beneath rib reminded the mother of verdicts waiting beyond her door. When labor finally came in straw pallet, in candle, stutter pain mingled with dread. Every scream risked neighbor ears. Every lull could be misread as fatal hush. If child's first cry pierced night, relief sighs met immediate worry. Who will claim this life, and at what cost? If no cry came, fear twisted into panic. How to prove accident when burial shovels answered question before it was asked. And after birth, when midwife cut cord and tied linen knot, another tether remained. Social judgment coiled around mother and child alike, a binding not easily severed by time, repentance, or the tender grasp of a tiny hand. Adultery, in the medieval mind, threatened more than marital vows. It endangered inheritance lines, disturbed alliances between families, and, in the most pious corners of Europe, was believed to invite divine retribution on whole communities. Because property and salvation were at stake, secular courts, ecclesiastical courts, village elders, and even aggrieved husbands devised a spectrum of penalties calibrated to make private sin publicly unforgettable. The same act committed by a man might draw a discreet fine or a pilgrimage. Committed by a woman, it often summoned stones, iron, or fire. For her womb knot, his seed was imagined as the archive where polluted lineage would be stored. In Norman England, the Royal Assize of Clarendon left adultery largely to church jurisdiction, yet local manorial rolls reveal harsher customs. A woman proven unfaithful could be paraded astride a skittish mare, facing the tail, her hair tied to the animal's dock so every buck jerked her head back, forcing eyes to the judgmental sky. Villagers threw rotten pippins, chanting "horse for the whore," while reeves tallied each bruise as evidence of communal zeal. The journey ended at the churchyard lychgate, where priest and husband met the procession. Absolution depended on the latter's nod, and more than one betrayed wife found herself refused, left to hobble home alone, dignity trailing like the mare's fading hoofprints. Across the Channel, Capetian France codified the concept of flagrant adultery. If a husband caught his wife in the act, he might, under certain ordinances, kill both lovers with impunity, provided he used a household wapano sword. Only a fireplace poker or candlestick dough signifies spontaneous rage rather than premeditated honorary slaying. Should he spare them, the woman still faced judicial penance. Shaved crown, iron collar, life in a convent cellule so narrow she could neither stretch fully nor kneel upright. A notary's entry from Tours describes one such cell, 2 cubits long, 1 cubit wide, vented by a slit that admitted winter wind and cathedral bells in equal measure. The adultery had lasted a single harvest season. The sentence lasted a lifetime. Italy added theater to law. In Siena, guilty couples were bound to back on a wooden platform outfitted with wheels, rolled through contrade while drummers beat cadences stolen from carnival but stripped of joy. At each district fountain, the woman was forced to drink scoopfuls of brackish water-symbolic cleansing that left her retching. The man, if married, paid a monetary penalty and was freed at sundown. The woman's ordeal extended to dawn, when she stood barefoot before the Palazzo Pubblico to hear her dowry voided. Her children, if any, declared bastards ineligible for guild apprenticeship. Documents note spectators brought lanterns to savor her shivering silhouette against the gray walls, a living fresco of fallen chastity. Further east, in the principalities of Rus, punishment merged with liturgical drama. The Domostroi advised husbands to flagellate adulterous wives, without fury, yet without pity, quoting proverbs while birch rods hissed. For repeated offense, a wooden collar called a kabila, literally, mare, was clamped around the woman's neck, studded with oak pegs that bruised shoulders at every step. She wore it during church services, forced to stand just inside the narthex, hearing chants but barred from Eucharist. Chroniclers describe parishioners crossing themselves each time her collar thumped pews, as though warding off contagion. Some collars carried engraved scripture. Others, crude depictions of devils whispering into feminine ears, ensuring bystanders absorbed doctrine alongside spectacle. In German imperial cities, adultery intersected with emerging guild economies. A baker's wife convicted in Augsburg not only faced flogging, but a ban from markets, a penalty that effectively ruined household income. To emphasize economic betrayal, officials baked saltless bread symbol of joyless sustenance and hung loaves around her neck with twine. She wandered the square, offering pieces to passers-by. Acceptance meant complicity in her disgrace, so most declined, letting crusts harden until they rattled like wooden beads. At dusk, the loaves were fed to pigs, a parable of squandered grain, squandered virtue. Ecclesiastical courts often imposed pilgrimages as penance, yet even these journeys encoded hierarchy. Men traveled to Santiago de Compostela, a route lined with hostels and indulgent sellers. Women, deemed untrustworthy on long roads, walked circuits around parish boundaries for months, ankles shackled with light chains whose gentle clang announced each step of repentance. Rain rusted links green, skirts frayed at hem. Children mimicked the sound and play long after the woman completed her rounds, the echo perpetuating her lesson. Not all regions pursued bodily harm. In the Low Countries, confession and monetary compensation, sometimes sufficed yet priceless, reveal sharp gender disparity. One ledger from Bruges sets the penance for male adultery at 8 stuvers, For women, the same crime costs 8 stuvers plus a tunic of fine linen donated to the church, ensuring visual penance when clergy processed in garments bought by her shame. Should she lack funds, the deficit translated into days spent sweeping city gutters under watch of beetles, who measured progress not by cleanliness, but by the thickness of mud spattering her skirts. Socially, consequences rippled far beyond sentence. Guild charters excluded daughters of adulteresses from apprenticeship, branding entire families with a generational stain immune to absolution. Marriage negotiations hinged on whispers. A cousin's infidelity could diminish dowries across an extended kin network. In Provence, notaries inserted secret Marxeny crosses in margins beside contracts involving women of tainted line, silent warnings to future readers, weighing trust. Literature mirrored law. Ballads sung in taverns portrayed faithless wives as wolves in linen, their howls luring unsuspecting husbands toward ruin. Moral plays staged at Corpus Christi feast cast adulteresses in red wool gowns that smoldered under torchlight, while demons tugged invisible threads sewn into seams, yanking the women toward hellmouths painted on canvas. Audience laughter blended with relief. Sin performed by actors spared real women that night, though mourning might choose new players. Medical theory supplied grim rationale. Physicians claimed female bodies ran hotter, their wombs itching for excess embrace. Unchecked heat invited hysteria, madness, even spontaneous combustion. As recounted in an Italian compendium citing a Florentine innkeeper's wife who allegedly burst aflame during tryst. The fantastic tale, shared from lecture halls to leprosaria, buoyed laws by framing punishment as prevention of literal female explosion. Yet behind every statute lay stories of cunning. Some women maintained clandestine liaisons for years, through coded spindle whorls passed in market spindles, carved with patterns decipherable only by lovers. Others bribed priests to misstate baptismal records, masking paternity. A notorious Parisienne, Isabelle Lapaule, faked illness monthly to avoid marital bed, timing rendezvous instead. When discovered, she pled demonic possession, and inquisitors argued for exorcism rather than execution. A loophole she survived despite chains and holy water. Still, most adulteresses lacked such stratagems and succumbed to penalties shaped by locale, season, and the temper of those judging them. Their voices seldom appear in parchment beyond terse confessions extracted under threat, yet damage endures in quiet genealogies. Children listed as spurious, husbands remarried hastily, widows entering convents with haircut to penitential length. The geography of disgrace mapped itself onto bodies and streets, etching memory into cobblestones where clatter of hooves or church bells could, for a fleeting instant, resurrect the distant footfall of a mare ridden backwards by a woman whose only crime was desire expressed in the wrong century. At night, long after verdicts were read and torches doused, the adulteress often lay in a separate boudoir, cell listening to silence heavy with possibility. That the child stirring within might resemble someone else, that neighbors tomorrow might measure glances too closely, that a single whispered memory could reopen wounds courts had tried to seal with blood or coin. Punishment ended on parchment, yet the sentence of memory renewed itself each dawn, as relentless as church bells tolling matins over roofs where trust once slept untroubled. Punishments evolved with law, but lingered in idiom. French still carries porter la cagaterie to bear the hypocrites' yoke-recalling wooden collars once forced on unfaithful wives. Russian folk songs warn girls not to dance by moon with another man's shadow lest rods count their steps come morning. Even when statutes faded, echoes remained, threading caution through lullabies and gossip. Poets occasionally mourned adulteresses with unexpected tenderness. The Provençal troubadour Guillaume de Montenhagel wrote of a lady branded for love, her scar, a crimson flower no winter could wilt. Clerics condemned the verse, yet scribes copied it, marginalia noting how ink bloomed where flesh once burned. Some women resisted through subterfuge. Italian apothecaries sold herbal pessaries said to prevent conception, allowing affairs to pass unremarked. Spanish healers brewed potions of pennyroyal and rue, double-edged elixirs that could avert pregnancy or end it, gambling a lesser sin against the greater. Authorities banned such remedies. Demand persisted, concealed in hem-stitched purses and whispered code. Behind the formality of courts loomed vigilante retribution. Villagers in the Alps practiced the tar barrel, rolling an adulteress downhill in an empty cask once used for pitch, bruising limbs while smearing skin with resin scent. No statute endorsed it, yet no bailiff hurried uphill to stop it either. Likewise, Welsh mining communities stripped guilty women to chemise and chased them across slag heaps, soot turning linen gray, marking disgrace long after lungs expelled their last terrified breath. Church penance manuals offered spiritual remedies, fasting, pilgrimages, candle offerings, yet many women, lacking funds or freedom, could complete neither pilgrimage nor purchase wax. They settled for endless confession cycles, repeating contrition until priests themselves grew weary. One English rector noted he assigned a weeping adulteress to recite the Psalter daily for a year. 6 months in, he confessed the ritual, numbed both our souls, though the penance continued. Notices of leniency surface rarely, but speak volumes. In Bruges, a magistrate pardoned a miller's wife after her husband, bedridden and impotent, testified that her affair kept grain bags full. The court fined her lover instead, calling his trespass use without lease. Such cases prove scandalous enough to enter town chronicles. Their rarity underscores prevailing severity. Judicial double standards remain stark. A Florentine merchant caught with a mistress paid a simple condata fee token compensation to wife's family, then resumed business. His wife, had she strayed, faced confinement to a convent or dowry forfeiture. Merchants defended the asymmetry by citing risk. A man's liaisons could not seat a rival heir within family holdings, whereas a woman's could. Commerce, not chastity, drove the moral calculus. Italian city-states blended law with theatrical flair. In Siena, an adulteress could be condemned to carry a candle made of black wax through the streets at dusk, its flame guttering an evening breeze. She was to keep it alight. If wind extinguished it, guards reignited the wick and added a circuit of the city walls to her route. By night's end, her arm trembled from effort, wax dripped across fingers, and the scent of smoke clung to her shift like a half-burnt confession. Islamic jurisdictions under the Ottomans followed. Zina, codes. Proof required 2 male witnesses or confession, but rumor alone could spark unofficial retribution. If guilt was established, stoning loomed, though in practice, many provincial judges commuted sentence to lashing, reasoning that stones risked killing the unborn should the woman be pregnant. Travelers observed that lashes fell with measured cadence, each stroke punctuated by Quranic verse to anchor punishment in divine order. European diplomats, recording these scenes, rarely mentioned parallel cruelties at home. In Germany, the Bavarian Landrecht permitted nose-wit slitting for female adultery, reviving a late Roman penalty once thought obsolete. Physicians argued the wound risked lethal infection. Lawmakers countered that a visible scar discouraged repeat offense and made remarriage unlikely, keeping disputed property safely in the husband's line. One municipal ledger from Regensburg notes a butcher's wife whose nose was spared after her spouse accepted a hefty payment of sausages and beer from her lover, proof that even honor could be itemized. England's ecclesiastical courts preferred fines, but allowed penance walks when purse was light. Barefoot, garbed only in a shift, the woman processed from parish boundary to altar, carrying a rod of birch longer than her height. At the chancel, she surrendered the rod, which the priest laid across the rail, a silent invitation for husband to accept it as instrument of household correction. Some did, others left it to dry beside baptismal font, a warning more eloquent than any sermon. The Iberian kingdoms weaponized apparel. A proven adulteress in Castile donned the manta de la infamia, a blanket cloak dyed yellow and black, colors of treason, then rode a mule through market lanes, while a crier listed her sins. The mule's tail was shaved to a stump, signifying severed fidelity. Merchants claimed the spectacle boosted sales. Women paused to haggle over oranges as the condemned passed, then resumed gossip, folding moral lessons into price of fruit. Russia's Domostroy, a 16th-century household manual heavy with ecclesiastical advice, instructed husbands to beat adulterous wives without anger, yet without mercy, then confined them to a dark storeroom for days of prayer and bread-muddy water fasting. If she repented, she might be returned to hearth. If not, the bishop's court could order public penance in the church porch, forehead pressed to cold stones while parishioners stepped over her bent body on their way to liturgy. Some priests sprinkled sand on the flagstones, so each movement scraped skin raw, a quiet reminder that salvation rarely came without abrasion. In northern France, the coutumes distinguished sharply between a straying husband, whose fine could be settled in coin, and a straying wife, whose body paid the price. A first offense drew a flogging at the town gate. A second, shaving in exile. A third, invited death by drowning in the nearest river. A fate the statutes called restoring purity to water. Chroniclers seldom condemned the disparity. Instead, they praised the law's economy. No property left the lineage. No bastard threatened inheritance. Adultery in the medieval mind threatened more than marital vows. It imperiled bloodlines, dowries, and the fragile web of contracts that glued small societies together. When a wife strayed, every heir's legitimacy flickered, and with it, the smooth passage of land, livestock, and allegiance. So courts, both sacred and secular, crafted punishments whose sting lasted long after flesh healed, ensuring memory outlived desire. Long before court clerks dipped quills, village whispers could spin a woman's ordinary habits into threads of witchcraft. A midwife who mixed herbs for cramps, a widow whose cat refused strangers, a girl whose eyes lingered too long on a passing storm. Each swayed ever so slightly outside custom, enough for fear to weave dread into their silhouettes. When that dread arrived at a magistrate's bench, the instruments of law and faith combined to unmake the female body, piece by piece, in search of the devil's signature. Germany's Rhine towns kept meticulous Hexen Protocolle, witch protocols where scribes recorded every tremor of interrogation. A woman, stripped to shift, stood upon a low stool, while matrons appointed by the council searched for maleficium marks, a mole that would not bleed, a scar shaped like crescent moon, a nipple said to suckle imps. Torches hissed, goosequill brushes, dusted skin with salt to make blemishes rise. One protocol lists 13 women examined in a single February dawn, frost feathering the stone floor as each was spun slowly, like merchandise displayed for purchase, except the currency sought was confession. Should inspection fail to yield proof, the body still became evidence through pain. In tribunals from Würzburg to Bamberg, torturers favored the Spanish stiefel, Spanish boot iron sheaths tightened by wedges driven between slats. Pressure splintered shin bones with a dull crack prisoners swore they felt in their teeth. Interrogators timed questions with each hammer strike. Who taught you charms? Which Sabbath did you ride? Name the other women. Some confessed anything to halt the wedges. Others fainted into a silence the court interpreted as obstinacy, not agony. The record shows little distinction. Elsewhere, in the Swiss canton of Vaud, courts relied on water and weight. The accused, bound in trust, was lowered into Lake Geneva. If she floated, the devil's favor held her up, and guilt was declared. If she sank, innocence would be acknowledged. Posthumously, should divers retrieve a corpse before currents swept it away. Bakers on the quays sold sweet rolls shaped like tiny women to spectators, sugared faces melting under morning sun, an edible echo of the drowning below. France's Parliament of Rouen introduced the question extraordinaire, a progression of tortures escalating from thumbscrews to rack, each stage ratified by theologians who argued the devil lashed conscience tighter than ropes ever could. One autumn session lists Gina Goupil enduring 8 turns of the rack before admitting she brewed storms over apple orchards. Her confession ended the inquiry. The storm that truly felled the fruit came 2 nights later, rain tearing blossoms from branches just as scribes dried ink on Jeannie's death sentence. Coincidence? Some muttered. Vindication. Others swore. In England, the witch hunt burned later, but once underway, flamed with bureaucratic vigor. Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general, toured East Anglia in the 1640s, pocketing fees for each conviction. His favored test was the searching chair. The accused, naked save for a linen smock, sat bound while women examiners prodded every crease for hidden teats. Needles pierced suspicious spots. If no blood welled, the place marked a witch's feeding nipple. One woman, Sarah Elsie, lost consciousness after a 2-hour probing. Hopkins noted her stubborn silence as further evidence, ignoring that she had slipped into shock. Colonial America inherited these methods, distilled by Puritan fervor. At Salem, magistrates questioned Sarah Good as her infant wailed from a jail corner, the child born in chains after arrest. When Good's lips moved, murmuring to soothe the babe, observers swore she conjured shapes in cell shadows. The infant died before trial ended. Ministers cited its death as proof the devil claimed his own. Sarah Good, led to gallows, uttered words the sheriff called a curse, the windy hilltop carried them away, leaving only the creak of rope and hush of onlookers, imagining hell opening beneath their shoes. Eastern Europe crafted tortures, less mechanical, more protracted. Polish courts utilized the praska, a wooden press, clamping fingers until nails split interrogators, pausing to let splinters fester, returning days later when infection weakened resolve. In Moravia, women were forced to kneel on coarse salt, iron weights on shoulders, reciting litanies hour after hour while scribes watched for stumbles that suggested demonic interference. Knees bled. Salt crystals found their way into wounds like prophetic sand, stinging with each prostration. Yet the body suffering alone seldom satisfied. Authorities wanted names, networks, a conspiracy to justify their zeal. Thus, torture aimed as much at multiplication as confession. A German baker's wife, frail and illiterate, named neighbors between sobs. Within weeks, those neighbors under torture named still others. Dread propagating like mold across rye bread. Some towns decimated half their female population before panic cooled. Then, abruptly, interest waned. The devil apparently relocated, leaving charred steaks and widowed children as testament to his brief residence. Amid brutality, small resistances flickered. Women memorized psalms to recite under questioning, turning interrogations into clandestine devotions. Some bit through tongues to avoid speaking at all, forcing courts to rely on gesture and assumption. A midwife in Lübeck feigned madness, babbling incoherently until judges declared her mind already a devil's ruin, unfit for trial. She lived out her days in a poorhouse rather than at the stake. Not freedom, but survival. Clergy occasionally interceded. Jesuit Father Friedrich Spee, confessor to condemned witches, penned Caudio Criminalis, arguing torture bred false admissions. His words traveled slow but lodged doubts in Jesuit and Lutheran hearts alike. Where courts once saw silence as guilt, some began to see it as exhaustion. Gradually, thresholds for evidence rose, racks gathered dust, searchers retired unrivaled. By 18th century dawn, laws against witchcraft dwindled, yet scars remained. Villages missing mothers, archives swollen with confessions no sane mind would utter. Folk memory clung to caution cats killed on sight for fear they carried spirits. Midwives eyed warily, though safer births owed them gratitude. The female body, once theater of diabolic possibility, had been both stage and casualty. Long after fires died, embers of suspicion smoldered in lullabies, warning girls not to wander fields at dusk, lest darkness mistake them for brides of something other than God. Ash settles, but bone endures. Archaeologists unearth stakes char marks in meadows, now blooming with wildflowers. Soil chemistry still registers heat of injustice centuries cooled. In transcripts locked beneath archive dust, calloused fingers trace lines pressed by scribes who believed truth emerged only when flesh broke. Their ink remains crisp, the parchment unblistered. Irony of durability, stark against bodies once riven by the pursuit of incorporeal evil. And in quiet rooms where scholars turn those pages, lamp-light guilds each recorded scream silent now, but inked into history's skin, a reminder that fear needs little more than rumor, authority, and a woman's ordinary body to grow teeth sharper than any wolf that ever haunted the edge of human firelight. Stone cloisters promised salvation, yet for many medieval women they served instead as quiet oubliettes, places where a family's embarrassment, a ruler's displeasure, or a priest's suspicion could be folded behind walls thick enough to muffle protest. A convent's facade of calm devotion, concealed corridors where punishment blended seamlessly with piety, turning prayer into both shield and shackle. To outsiders, the ringing of matins bells sounded like harmony. To some of the women enclosed within, each peal marked another hour, subtracted from a life already portioned out in penance. Entry was not always voluntary. In Tuscan notarial books, fathers unable to scrape together marriage portions for all their daughters signed contracts gifting the surplus girl to a convent, paying a smaller monastic dowry called the entrada. One scribe in Lucca recorded such a transaction in the same ledger line used for selling an olive grove, as though a 15-year-old's future and a stand of silver-leaf trees had equal roots in family economy. Day after day, young women crossed cloister thresholds, clutching linen trousseaux stitched by sisters they would never see again outside those walls. For others, the cloister replaced the jail. Burgundian town councils commuted sentences for adultery or unlicensed fortune edeltelling by delivering women to the Abbey of Saint-Andoc for spiritual correction. Correction meant isolation in narrow cells called locutoriums, where a grated window allowed only the abbess's eyes, never her hands, to enter. Meals arrived through a wooden hatch. Bread, black as veiled mold, water tasting faintly of iron chains, lowered daily into the cistern. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed silence except for psalms. Abbesses stretched that mandate until a penitent might go weeks, hearing nothing but her own heartbeat echoing against limestone. England favored the anchor hold, a chamber built tight against parish church walls, bricked on 3 sides, fronted by one interior window for communion and one exterior slit no wider than a man's palm. The anchorite who entered underwent a funeral rite symbolizing death to the world. Some women sought this life, others found it thrust upon them by bishops, eager to quarantine rumored scandal under a cloak of sanctity. Inside, the anchorite's horizon ended at 4 blank surfaces: stone, sweating in winter, sweating again in summer, dripping condensation onto straw bedding alive with beetles that scurried during compline, like black notes in an unwritten hymn. German convents introduced the disciplinarium, small barrel-vaulted rooms reserved for nuns who broke enclosure or argued in chapter. A penitential ladder leaned against one wall. The offender climbed, arms outstretched in imitation of crucifixion, while sisters recited the Miserere. Some women fainted after minutes. Others endured hours until joints locked. Records from Quedlinburg Abbey describe a sister left suspended overnight, her shoulders dislocated, voice reduced to soft hiccups that failed to disturb sleeping choir stalls just meters away. Morning prayers flowed around her like water around a stone, leaving no mark on the liturgy. France's Cistercian houses kept murata, cells literally walled, chamber-used, sparingly yet remembered vividly. A door admitted the woman only once. Masons sealed it behind her, with mortar still wet enough to smell like storm-soaked earth. A small hatch admitted bread, water, and confession. Whether the sentence spanned weeks or a lifetime depended on abbess and bishop. Parchment seldom recorded release dates. Visitors decades later sometimes heard knuckles tapping faint rhythms on stone. Morse code of souls suspended between world and tomb. Punishment was not always architectural. Daily life carried its own disciplines. Novices rose in pre-dawn, dark to chant while frost-furred lips. Failure to enunciate earned kneeling on flagstones dusted with lentil husks that etched tiny crescents into skin. Kitchen duty meant scalding arms in cauldrons while preparing gruel for the infirmary. A dropped ladle warranted 3 lashes from a willow rod kept beside the refectory crucifix. Silence reigned, but sound leaked through. The soft whistle of whip through air, the hiss of boiled fat for altar candles, the muffled sob swallowed before echo could betray emotion. Yet convents also served as warehouses for inconvenient heirs. Capetian princesses judged politically surplus were veiled at Fontevraud, their dowries swelling monastic coffers. Abbesses used that wealth to expand scriptoria, illuminating gospels, even as lay sisters scrubbed cloister floors bloody to meet weekly purity inspections. Royal daughters copied texts describing Mary's meek obedience, while hearing through cloister grills the weeping of penitents flogged for lacking such virtue. Ink dried glossy, like a thin veneer over contradictions braided into the cloister's breath. Commerce threaded through piety. Convents leased vineyards, milled grain, brewed ale. Labor fell to lay sisters, sentenced there by law or poverty, their toil financing choir stalls where noble nuns sang. Class rang louder than any sanctus. A Flemish account tells of Sister Agnes, born a merchant's daughter, condemned for harboring a runaway apprentice. She spent 12 years tanning parchment for psalters she would never read, the lime inflaming her lungs until chants rasped like saw teeth. When she died, the abbess praised her humility. Scribes recorded no burial sermon, only a notation that her cell now stood open for the next. Some women carved pockets of agency within restraint. Illiterate novices learned herbal lore from infirmarians, cultivating gardens whose walls could not imprison scents of thyme and lavender, sneaking into dormitories at night. Others composed spiritual visions so vivid inquisitors questioned their origin, forcing nuns to defend ecstasies that men simultaneously revered and feared. Hildegard of Bingen corresponded with emperors from her Rupertsberg monastery, turning enclosure into pulpit. Yet for every Hildegard, countless unnamed sisters stitched altar cloths until eyesight dimmed. their voices merging into choir until individuality dissolved like beeswax in candle heat. Escapes occurred. Court rolls from York report Alicia de Rydale scaling convent walls with bedsheets knotted into rope, vanishing into marshland, where search parties declined to follow after nightfall. Speculation claims she drowned. Whispers insisted fishermen ferried her to a distant port. Either way, she left behind a Ruley book annotated with tiny drawings of open doors, each hinge blooming into flowers. Her absence sanctified the community through caution. Security tightened, sheets shortened, hope of departure sealed with stronger mortar. Gradually, reform movements softened extremes. The Council of Trent demanded clearer separation between punishment and enclosure. Papal visitors inspected cells, condemning walls slick with moss. Some abbesses replaced rods with fasting, replaced Marotta with temporary solitude. Yet walls retained memory. Masonry, once mirrored with scratches of desperate fingernails, kept their shallow grooves under fresh limewash, silent footnotes to progress. Even when modernity breached, cloisters' railway whistles audible beyond garden hedges, motor cars rattling past gatehouses, the interior tempo of silence endured. Nuns watered roses where once prisoners bruised knees. Novices learned Gregorian chant in chapels, whose acoustics had carried lament centuries before. Visitors spoke of peace, unaware how many prayers had been bricked behind altars, calcified into mortar. At dusk, choirs intoned Compline, notes wafting through cloister walks where twilight pooled like ink in a well. Somewhere, a candle guttered beside an empty stall, wax running in rivulets down brass like tears shed for women whose names dissolved in wind, long departed through latticed windows. Outside, owls drifted over roof tiles, silent as the vows that locked generations. Inside, vows that looked like salvation on parchment, but, in the echoing dark, often sounded more like a door swinging shut on voices, meant to sing only what the walls permitted them to remember. Every town with a scaffold knew a man who walked its edge, and every woman condemned understood his measured stride long before she felt the tools he carried. The executioner, Scharfrichter in German cities, Barreau along the Seine, hangman, on English, greenswore death and discipline like invisible livery. Children peeked from doorframes when he passed. Women lowered eyes. Men murmured to hide unease. Yet on the day sentence fell, the same citizens pushed forward for a better view, trusting his practiced competence to make the punishment speak clearly. It was a strange profession, half O'Craft, half O'Curse. Guild records in Nuremberg list executioners beside tanners and smiths, paid a stipend, granted a house beyond the city ditch, supplied annually with gloves, wax linen, and blades. Yet bakers refused him bread. Tailors hiked their prices. He bought pork only from traveling swineherds because local butchers feared his coin. Marriage prospects narrowed to widows, servants, or daughters of previous executioners. Lineage looping inward like a serpent biting its tail. His children sat in church on a bench apart, the pew polished by generations of uneasy devotion. Skill mattered. A badly placed lash could gouge muscle and kill too soon. A sloppy branding iron might leave illegible scars. Dulling the warning meant for passers-by. Executioners apprenticed under fathers or uncles, learning anatomy through flayed carcasses, timing heartbeat rhythms by pressing ear to pigs' chests before slicing arteries. They ranked whips by weight, length, flex, identified optimal spacing between knots to raise welts without splitting skin, tuned their swing, so leather sang the same note, stroke after stroke, a grim music townsfolk recognized like a church bell tolling faults. Tools traveled in wooden chests, iron-strapped against theft. One compartment for cat-u-nine tails, each strand oiled with tallow, another for branding irons shaped in letters or symbols ordered by council decree, smaller drawers for gag screws, thumb-base screws, slender knives honed to shave hair before torching scalp. Heirs inherited chests along with techniques, how to bake an iron just hot enough that flesh hissed but did not ignite linen, how to pierce tongues through a board without shattering teeth, how to swing a broadsword in a clean arc so head parted instantly from body, mercy masquerading as precision. Records from Cologne recount weekly inspections. Magistrates tested rope tensile strength, measured blade edges against whetstone spark, weighed lead shot for scourging rods. Faulty gear fined the executioner for a botched act, reflected poorly on civic order. One misjudged beheading could sour trade for weeks. merchants blaming stalled sales on lingering bad luck. Thus, cities invested in competence, even as they shunned the competent. Despite isolation, the executioner wielded quiet influence. Town councils consulted him on torture protocols. Garrison surgeons borrowed his experience closing wounds, and midwives occasionally requested his herb she kept potent anodyne salves for flogged backs. Grateful patients left coins on his doorstep at night. He touched none until dawn, when public eyes slanted east and shadows dulled curiosity. Executioners observed a professional etiquette bordering on sanctity. Before branding, some whispered a prayer for steady hand. Before lashing, a measured breath to set rhythm. Before burning a witch, a whispered caution to apprentices. Aim torch at seasoned wood, not green. Smoke suffocates. He could not absolve, but could mitigate. A deeper cut to shorten agony. A tighter noose to hasten neck snap. Women sensed kindness, where crowd saw monstera, slight slackening of strap over shoulders. A discreet cloth under knees on freezing flagstones. Such mercies rarely reached ledger, but passed in inmate murmurs, dark gratitude branching through cells. Yet, he remained tool as much as wielder. Orders arrived sealed by ring impression, leaving no room for refusal. When Lubeck authorities decreed ear removal for repeated disobedience, the executioner merely selected his smallest scalpel, spread cloth to catch the severed piece, dipped it in salt to present proof completion. Once, a foreign merchant offered bribe to spare his adulterous wife's nose. The executioner accepted gold, then performed the cut any wanner of craft above coin, though he kept the coin too, burying it beneath stable straw, payment for the weight his conscience would carry. Festivals complicated matters. On feast days, punishments drew larger crowds. Burgomasters pressed for spectacle, befitting holiday mood. Executioners rehearsed sequences. Flourish of whip, pause for applause. Brand brought forward glowing cherry red. Pacing mattered too swift and revelers felt cheated. Too slow and drunk tempers soured. A Strasbourg account praises Master Ulrich for painting justice upon flesh, as deftly as an artist upon canvas, his flourish so exact that flicked blood-dotted ground in even semicircles. Later, children traced those spots with sticks. A grisly hopscotch, where each jump echoed a woman's scream, now fading in memory, but etched in stone pour. Superstition clung to his footsteps. When plague loomed, city fathers hired the executioner as plagueaburier, reasoning his touch already trafficked in death. He learned to perfume his gloves with juniper, believing the scent deflected miasma. Women crossing his path spat thrice, yet crossed themselves for luck, torn between dread and reluctant respect. Executioners themselves faced punishment when misstepping. A Zurich master caught gambling away tax-set oticides was sentenced to stand where his victims had. Tied to whipping post, bare back displayed, his apprentice delivered stroke slider, perhaps, yet public. The crowd hushed, uneasy spectators to inversion of roles, punishment turning upon the instrument. Afterward, he resumed office, shoulders striped beneath tunic, lashcraft unimpeded, but humility sewn into each future knot. Some kept journals. Fragments survive. Daybooks noting name, crime, number of stripes, fee collected. Weather notes jotted amid blood tallies. Rain kept crowd thin. East wind complicates torch flame. Rare lines reveal doubt. She prayed as I struck, voice small but steady. Crowd laughed. I felt nothing. Must sharpen blades tonight. History inherits these margins, faint pencil in ledgers, heavy with law. Reminders that even the hand of punishment sometimes trembled in dark quiet of early dawn. When death finally met the executioner himself, burial posed dilemma. Consecrated ground often barred his corpse. Some towns allocated a corner outside churchyard wall, marked only by stacked stones. Apprentices interred father, then returned to his deserted house, tools waiting in whispering shadows. The chest opened, blades gleamed. The cycle, like a tightened rope, held fast. And every woman sentenced afterward learned his successor's name, heard stories of his accuracy, prayed perhaps for deliberate sharpness rather than sloppy mercy. She stood before post or brand or block, sensing in the measured distance between his boots and her body the strange intimacy shared by two outcasts, one condemned by verdict, the other by profession. Pain would follow, and the law would applaud, but for an instant before the first strike fell, the executioner's eyes might meet Hirstu's souls caught inside machinery of order. each necessary, each expendable, their moment together, carved in silence, deeper than any wound he was bound to deliver. Markets opened with bread, bells, and blood, and children learned to taste them all at once. Before they could recite the Pater Noster without stumbling, many already knew the smell of rawhide striking skin, the crack that rose over a square like a cockerel heralding dawn. Adults insisted these sights were necessary. Punishment visible made sin invisible. Deterrence settled into the marrow of the young before mischief could flower into crime. So boys balanced on barrels to glimpse the lash. Girls clutched dollar bundles while counting stripes. Embroidery hoops forgotten as curiosity stitched new memories beneath their ribs. In London's Cheapside, a whipping post stood near the pillory, close enough that the cries of thieves and scolds mingled with the bray of donkeys and the calls of fruit sellers. Apprentice butchers, excused from stalls for the spectacle, came armed with spoiled offal to hurl at offenders. One parish record notes a 9-year-old, Thomas Kitchen, praised by his master for a throw that struck square between a branded woman's shoulders. The praise doubled as training. Tomorrow, Thomas would cleave carcasses. Today, he practiced distance and indifference. German free cities scheduled certain punishments for feastives, assuring larger crowds and therefore broader instruction. When St. Jacob's Day approached in Augsburg, schoolmasters dismissed classes early so children could reach the Hauptplatz before the executioner began his work. Teachers claimed civic duty. Scripture lessons could be resumed next week, but the spectacle of justice struck deeper than chalk on hornbook slates. A chronicler described how youngsters mimicked the cadence of the whip by slapping tabletops later that afternoon, their play spelling dread in rhythms adults had delivered straight into small ears. Not all learning occurred outdoors. In cloister schools, novices sometimes witnessed disciplinary floggings within chapter house walls. Boys training for the priesthood were reminded that the soul, like flesh, responded to measured correction. They observed bare backs reddened beneath rods, counting aloud in Latin to steady the arm of the disciplinarian. One Benedictine manual advised abbots to rotate spectators weekly, so no child is deprived of salutary terror. The same passage recommended warm straw for the punished to lie upon afterward. A mercy children filed away. Cruelty could be bracketed by token care without losing effect. Across the Pyrenees, Spanish processions of naked penance, desnudes de pena, became traveling classrooms. Parents hoisted toddlers to shoulders as condemned women shuffled past, cords at waists highlighting absence of cloth elsewhere. Mothers hushed giggles, instructing girls that virtue clothed better than silk. Fathers warned sons that desire unchecked led to hair shorn and backs scourged. Yet historians note how some children's eyes lingered not on shame but on boldness. The way a punished woman held her head despite jeers, the curve of muscles beneath exposed skin. Lessons diverged from intent, branching unseen like roots beneath cobblestones. In the Low Countries, guild pageants occasionally staged mock punishments between morality plays, blending theater and recent memory. Children sold sweet fritters to onlookers, their small hands sticky with sugar as they watched faux thieves beaten with soft rope. Applause guided them to laugh on cue, but the previous week's real whipping on the same scaffold still haunted the boards. Boundary blurred. Pretend pain echoed genuine cries. Genuine relief from pretend rescue soothed no historical back. A 7-year-old unaware of the switch might believe the town punished again and again, whipping one endless body, shifting faces beneath the blows. The ducking chair by village ponds became a playground after sentences ended. Ropes removed, seat drying in sun, local boys dared one another to sit where scolds had writhed hours earlier. Splashing contests followed adult example. A partner seized chair arm, plunged volunteer into murky water, timing, submersion to laughter rather than law. What had been juridical humiliation softened into sport, yet each splash retained whisper of original intent, like aftertaste in reused cup. Girls watched and learned stakes of voice. Speak too sharply and games might reverse against them someday. Religious festivals provided sanctioned tales of suffering to reinforce what children saw. Mystery plays dramatized scourging of Christ. Props mirrored real instruments stored in town armory. A child who glimpsed iron scourges backstage could match them to marks on a neighbor's mother, flogged for gossip months prior. Narrative threads tying sacred pain to civic. Piety and punishment wove braid thick enough to bind conscience without need for constant legal knots. In Scandinavian fishing hamlets, Elders gathered youth on evenings, following public humiliation rituals to debrief moral meaning. They sat round hearths, smoke curling into rafters, recounting sagas where prideful women met watery deaths or shorn locks signaled downfall. Children repeated verses until embers dimmed, internalizing caution alongside folklore. Some later confessed to priests that nightmares placed their own mothers on ducking stools, the line between cautionary tale and potential future drawn razor-thin by firelight. Even in monasteries meant to shield orphans, echoes persisted. Oblate boys at Monte Cassino copied manuscripts depicting martyrs, flayed or grilled on iron racks, embellishing margins with tiny figures wielding whips. Brothers praised illumination skill, unaware, uninterested how lovingly the child rendered blood drops. Art served devotion, but also rehearsed violence without consequence, training steady hands that might one day draft real instruments of correction. Critiques surfaced. Humanist scholars like Erasmus protested that violent spectacles sow but bitter fruit in tender gardens, urging civic leaders to fine rather than flog. Pamphlets circulated condemning little eyes made bold by blood. Yet economic and theological inertia outweighed reform. Spectacles cost less than prisons, satisfied appetite for order, and, officials argued, kept future misbehavior at bay. Paradox flickered at edges. Some punished women later taught compassion to children who had jeered them, nursing neighbors' infants despite scorn. A midwife in Rouen, once branded V for voleur, delivered half the quarter's babies. Toddlers touched her scar with wonder. Mothers averted gaze in shame, yet beds warmed safely under her guidance. Thus, early lessons could fray under counterexamples, though scars ensured memory never fully healed. As centuries turned, public punishment waned, but its imprint remained in nursery rhymes, warning girls not to sit in the stocks, in playground rhymes that substituted lashing sounds for drum beats. Industrial smoke replaced flogging cries, yet factory foremen wielded canes while child workers recalled ancestors' squares. Where whips fell silent, whistles shouted. Where stocks rotted, detentions stacked desks into miniature prisons. Discipline adapted, the early spectators now wielding smaller rods of their own. On quiet nights, rust creaks through abandoned pillories stored in museum lofts. Guides wipe dust, preparing exhibits for school tours. Children file past, clutching worksheets, drawing whip posts and pencil outlines, assessing artifacts behind glass. No bloodstains remain, only grain-darkened wood, but imagination, colors, blanks, older eyes have learned to look through. They exit into daylight, chatter, mingling with traffic, hum, carrying forward a lineage of lessons first etched in flesh and echoed in their ancestors' eager gaze. The door of a medieval household did not always close behind a bride with the gentle click of welcome. For many women, it slammed like the latch on a cell, sealing a lifelong contract of obedience, enforced not by distant courts, but by the hand that shared her bed. A wedding, bright with ribbon cakes and church incense, could serve as civic ceremony and subtle indictment both. A public proclamation that this woman now belonged to a man who, by scripture and statute, wielded power to punish her within walls no bailiff routinely breached. Law books hid domination beneath tidy Latin. England's common law doctrine of coverture merged wife into husband, one flesh, meaning one legal personis. He answered for her debts, yet owned her labor. He shielded her in theory, yet struck her in practice, and courts largely looked away. The Icelandic Gragas spelled it plainly. A man might beat his spouse with rod or whip of reasonable thickness. Thickness remained undefined, elastic as temper. In Saxony, the Saxon Spiegel allowed a husband to wound a wife without mortal danger, should she defy command. Local judges measured mortal danger by survival, not suffering. The architecture of homes reflected rites of correction. A hall's central beam often bore iron rings under pretext of hanging lanterns, but neighbors knew some doubled as restraint points. A chest near hearth might store winter linens beside a willow switch soaked in brine for suppleness. When evening prayers ended and shutters barred night winds, that switch whispered through air, teaching children how silence followed fear like smoke follows flame. Custom varied by region. In Lombardy, fines targeted men who broke wives' bones, but bruises remained private commerce. In Swabia, husbands convicted of excessive cruelty walked barefoot through market carrying the very rod used, paying shame for shame. Yet once penance ended, returned to same threshold, rod returned to same nail. Kingdoms weighed domestic authority against public order, rarely tipping scales toward the bruised. Ecclesiastical courts preached moderation. Sermons extolled Mary's meekness. Confessors urged husbands to chastise, with charity as father corrects child. Charity could still swell skin purple. A parish priest in Norfolk wrote that he counseled a miller to swap oak cudgel for braided cord so flesh not break. The miller complied. Reporting cord left prettier stripes, neat as grain rows in field. The priest, satisfied, noted improvement in ledger of souls. For noble women, marriage chains gilded with property. Queens wore jeweled girdles, yet sought papal letters permitting separate chambers after blows. Eleanor of Aquitaine petitioned Rome for annulment, citing unnatural rigors from Louis. Her request failed, leaving historians to read between illuminated lines for bruises hidden beneath ermine. In lesser courts, a countess might retreat to family castle, but dowry clauses forced return, lest silver candlesticks revert to husband's kin. Rich or poor, sanctuary seldom lasted beyond next negotiation. Communal charters occasionally curbed extremes. The city of Zurich decreed that wives could summon guild elders to witness wounds. Carpenters inspected swelling, masons examined cuts, tailors took statements, yet verdict delivered fines payable from household purse effectively, charging the woman for her own beating. Still, records show some husbands moderated hands after second fine-drained ale allowance. Reform crept like ivy, slow, ornamental, easily trimmed back. Literacy opened rare paths of protest. A Welsh woman named Nest A.P. Gruffydd pinned complaint to Bishop describing nightly blows, falling like rye in winnowing season. The letter survived because clerks saved it as curiosity, a wife comparing fist to harvest. The bishop admonished her spouse by epistle and suggested pilgrimage penance. Road dust cooled temper for a month, then bruises returned. Paper condemned violence while walls preserved it. Some wives wielded counters. In Flanders, guild widows told daughters to craft stout belts braided from oxhide, worn beneath gowns to absorb impact. Lombard merchant women boiled pig fat into balms that yellowed bruises rapidly, concealing evidence before quarterly manor courts circulated. Midwives taught stealth herbs arnica to dull swelling, feverfew for ache-shanded like contraband between linen folds. Remedies stitched solidarity in kitchens after curfew, whispers traveling faster than parish decrees. Yet, retaliation carried peril. Legal commentaries warned that a wife striking husband forfeited dower land. One Parisian baker's wife, Madeleine, clawed her spouse's cheek when whip cracked too near infant cradle. The baker gathered blood upon handkerchief, presented it to Provost, who declared his honor scarred. Madeleine spent 3 days in pillory. Townspeople, sympathetic, tossed soft bread instead of stones. Yet law recorded mark against her name, while Baker's ledger remained clean. Deaths behind doors surfaced only when bodies spoke too loudly to ignore. Coroners in York noted rib fractures consistent with fall. Testimony coaxed from widowers who claimed icy stares. Sometimes neighbors testified the sound of thud, sudden hush, but juries favored master of house unless witness count matched blows. Even so, severe sentences rare. A fine, a day in stocks, perhaps temporary confiscation of whip. Marriage retained privilege of calibrated violence. Religion granted mystical framing. Preachers likened husband to Christ, wife to church, scourge as rod of correction, guiding soul toward salvation. Illustrations in books of hours showed St. Paul admonishing wives to submit, vine scrolls curling round capital letters like shackles disguised as art. In such images, daughters learned posture. Head bowed slightly, eyes lowered, hands folded, the body reading itself into marginalia. Still, acts of quiet defiance flickered. Records from Ghent describe a weaver's wife who, beaten nightly, crept into workshop and snapped loom strings so cloth miswove. Husband cursed, lost profit, struck anew. She snapped again. After third ruinous week, he traded whip for patience, fearing empty purse more than wounded pride. The ledger credits economic necessity, but local ballad celebrates cunning fingers, weaving freedom into warp. Black Death's upheaval briefly tipped scales. Labor scarcity in 14th century England gave surviving wives leverage. A man beating spouse risked her flight to another holding eager for workers. Manorial courts chased runaways, yet often settled for fine, lacking manpower to farm domain. Violence slowed when fists threatened harvest. Prosperity later restored imbalance, but memory lingered. For a generation, some husbands swung with hesitation. Colonial expansions exported domestic dominion across oceans. Spanish settlers carried fuero, customs to New Spain. Indigenous observers recorded mestizo wives appearing with bruised faces near mission walls. Friars preached gentleness, but encomenderos invoked Castilian privilege. English Puritans in Massachusetts codified moderate chastisement into town orders. Magistrates measured rods to Thumgurtha, false precision, for anger ignored units. Modernity's arrival shifted scenery, not script. Steel factories replaced thatch roofs, yet wives still slept beside men armed with fists. Police stations existed, but shame and dependence barred entry. Some nations passed married women's property acts, granting legal identity, yet habit outran statute. It would take centuries, suffrage, and slow cultural thaw before marriage shed last vestiges of silent cage, though echoes still ring in certain homes. In village museums where bridal chests display lace veils and bone-handled knives, guides rarely mention second purpose of knives. Yet grain of hardwood shows faint nicks, where blade struck not breadboard but table edge and warning. Guests admire embroidery, pass to next exhibit. Meanwhile, dust motes drift through sunlit rafters like quiet ghosts, invisible until caught by beam-thin bright, swirling, impossible to ignore for the heartbeat before they settle again, waiting for footsteps to stir them back into restless dance. Dawn stretched pale light across cobbles, still slick from night rain, and already merchants jostled for stall space, wagon wheels groaning under sacks of barley, baskets of eels, bolts of dyed wool bright as autumn leaves. A medieval market never smelled of a single thing. It smelled of all things at once warm bread, wet leather, sheep dung, crushed herbs, sweat rising from bodies packed close. Into that thick inhalation of commerce, the city authorities threaded another scent, iron warmed by sun and stained by old blood, a reminder that trade and terror could share the same air. Punishment scheduled for market day ensured maximum audience. Councils argued efficiency one gathering served two civic needs, goods exchanged and order displayed, but the underlying calculus leaned toward spectacle. If a lash cracked tree bark in a silent forest, no conscience trembled. If it cracked in a square where 50 fishwives haggled over herrings, every barter paused, silver half-counted, morality staked its claim beside the scales. The moment justice strutted onto the stage, the market became amphitheater, and townsfolk its restless chorus. Executioners understood choreography. In Lubeck, they positioned whipping posts at junction of three main alleys so surging crowds from each direction funneled naturally into viewing arc. Assistants uncoiled rope like actors, preparing scene, hammering manacles, loud enough to draw glances, but not so early as to dull anticipation. Minutes before sentence, criers strode the periphery, exaggerating charges. A wife who mocked her master. A girl who brewed forbidden drafts. Hyperbole spiced rumor, and rumor swelled throng larger than any ordinance could require. Vendors seized opportunity. The cheese cow seller near cathedral steps hawked holy curds to purify sinful tongues, winking at purchasers who nibbled while assessing culprits' alleged crimes. The alewife stationed casks within smelling distance of sweat, promising courage and foam for those wary of gore. Children ran errands for parents unwilling to surrender prime vantage, returning with almond cakes if the line to pillory grew slow. Friction of money changed pockets, even as friction of rope burned wrists. Punishment lubricated commerce as surely as coin greased council palms. Musicians sometimes provided soundtrack. In Ferrara, the city trumpeter sounded a flourish at each stroke of scourge, brass notes slicing air sharper than knotted lash. Chroniclers compared rhythm to carnival, though faces of the punished never matched festive murals fringing archways. In Toulouse, drummers from the watch marched round pillory, tapping steady cadence. Spectators soon clapped along, turning agony into communal entertainment no pageant master could rival. Not all roles belonged to men. Women of the Bake Guild were tasked with distributing broken bread loaves to paupers after flogging ended charity staged as moral antidote to violence just witnessed. Yet many spectators ignored the loaves, still craning necks for glimpse of blood shimmering on post where afternoon light struck like gilding. Mothers pressed cloth to ears of toddlers when screams peaked, then resumed haggling 2 breaths later. Lessons in compartmentalization passed down like heirloom ladles. Theatrical devices evolved. In Bruges, to enhance visibility, carpenters built a rotating platform. the condemned secured to upright frame that turned slowly, offering every quadrant of market equal share of shame. Children counted revolutions. Fishmongers timed price shouts with each alignment. Pickpockets worked, distracted pockets, while eyes fixed on center stage. City fathers applauded engineering as triumph of civic ingenuity. Proof punishment could modernize, just as drainage ditches or defensive earthworks did. Animals wandered through tableau. Geese hissed at splattered blood. Dogs licked residue. Horses stamped iron shoes near fallen tears. An Italian traveler remarked that a rooster crowed exactly as branding iron touched flesh. Audience gasping at omen. Next week, authorities paid a boy to hide behind platform with caged rooster, releasing bird at decisive instant, a prophet turned prop, sincerity engineered for future crowds. Spectacle blurred boundaries between sacred and profane. On Corpus Christi Eve in Valencia, procession halted, while a woman convicted of thievery endured 10 lashes before the host passed. Clergy justified juxtaposition. Divine mercy contrasted human justice, elevating both. But many watchers later swore they remembered stripes more vividly than monstrance jewels, pain engraving deeper than gold's glint. Occasionally, spectacle collapsed under weight of empathy. In Prague, a butcher's daughter, sentenced for forbidden dance on charity feast, shrieked so piteously that market women dropped baskets mid-square, rushing forward with cloaks to shield her. Guards pushed them back, but jeers shifted toward scaffold, and magistrates aborted final strokes fearing riot. City Annals record fine levied on ringleaders. Yet credit incident with curbing frequency of public floggings for a decade, proof that theater could breed revolt when audience recast themselves as rescuers. Authorities responded by diversifying location. Rather than Central Plaza, some punishments relocated to bridge approaches or churchyards still public, but choke points limited interference. In Paris, the Petit Pont served as natural corridor. Spectators trapped mid-crossing either watched or jostled, their movement disguised as river beneath, current carrying gossip downstream to hungry suburb. Merchants measured morning takings against severity of sentences. A busy flogging day meant brisk cloth sales customers, drawn by spectacle, lingered to inspect dye quality, but branding too gruesome could dampen appetite. Ledger notes from Antwerp Cloth Hall mention Day of the Year. Referencing mutilation so grisly, even hardy dock workers skipped midday meals, purchases dipping 15%. Next quarter, aldermen restricted ear removals to Mondays when trading lighter, wounding commerce less than convict. Winter altered mise en scène. Cold air froze tears before they reached chin. Blood congealed black against snow. Making contrast, painters later tried to capture in oils. Punishment posts fitted with iron braziers cast eerie glow on frost, sparks swirling like festive embers, yet their heat warmed spectators' hands more than victims' shoulders. Vendors sold mulled wine pitched as antidote to chill and to sorrow, though few admitted which sensation they sought to numb. Children reenacted scenes in alleyways. Broomstick for post, red berries smeared on cheeks for wounds, shoelace knotted round wrists. Parents chastised but seldom forbade. Reasoning that play digested fear into safe portions, though some mothers whispered that games looked too real, eyes too bright. Thus, spectacle seated future performers and future audiences alike, ensuring continuity after decrees changed. By late 17th century, philosophers murmured that civilization should hide its punishments. Market stalls would thrive without screams. Order could emanate from quiet prisons instead. Gradually, scaffolds dismantled, posts uprooted, pillories sold as firewood, but stones retained memory. Rainwater pooled in slight depressions left by platforms. Pigeons pecked grain where once blood dotted mortar. On silent mornings, old merchants claimed, you could almost hear echo of drumbeat if you set ear to cobble market dagos trapped in pour of granite, unwilling to fade completely. Newer generations strolled plazas, unaware of echoes beneath boots, but architecture whispered lessons nonetheless. Wide squares catered to festivals, yet design born from need to hold crowds for punishment remained. When trumpets heralded monarchs or fireworks hissed on Feast of Saints, space functioned again as theater, jubilation layered over ancient fear. Spectacle survived by changing costume. Where once leather cracked, now music soared. Where iron-collared flesh, now satin ribbons fluttered. Yet city stones, impartial archivists, kept both scripts side by side. a waiting audience perceptive enough to feel the faint tremor of old applause riding on breeze between stalls of bread, bells of blessing, and commerce that never paused, even when justice screamed at its very heart. Some pain never made it into parchment, not because it lacked severity, but because no one with ink and authority found it worth recording. These were the punishments not announced by town criers or processed past baker stalls. They happened behind shutters, beneath rafters, under the jurisdiction of fathers, husbands, abbots, or guards. No sentence was read aloud, no crowd gathered. The whip cracked in silence, and the only record was the body itself, marked in bruises that faded before the next market day. In domestic chambers across Europe, justice was often handwritten in scars. A nobleman in Flanders might beat his wife with a braided sash rather than a rod softer, quieter, unlikely to rupture skin but no less precise. The maidservant who overheard it told no one she needed her place. The chambermaid fetching bandages learned to keep her gaze lowered. The bruised woman stayed in bed for days, explaining to visitors that she had fallen down the cellar steps. The lie became a proverb. Cellar stairs are steep for women with sharp tongues. Manorial records list no fines for these beatings. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally intervened, but only when blood soaked through the linens or someone spoke too loudly at the wrong table. Most of the time, the law deferred to the house's authority, and in the house, the male voice ruled. In convents, cells doubled as sites of punishment and isolation. A novice who disobeyed the rule might be locked overnight in the herb-drying room. No heat, no light, just hanging bunches of mint and rue above a straw mat. She would not scream. She was taught not to. Instead, she traced psalms in dust on the stone floor with her finger. The next day, she returned to Vespers with puffy eyes and hoarse voice. No entry recorded the correction. The silence proved she had learned. Jails dark, low-roofed, and pocked with, damn-fausted their own unofficial rituals. Women prisoners often slept two to a plank to keep warm, sharing lice and whispered prayers. But the guards had keys, and those keys opened doors no one else approached. When a woman returned from the black room, she walked differently. Sometimes she didn't speak again. The other women didn't ask. They knew, and the ledger showed no mark, except maybe a tick beside her name to note, less disorderly since Friday. In Hospitalsif, the word can be used for damp stone halls where the poor rotted in linen shifts treatments blurred with punishment. Mad women were strapped to benches with leather cords that rubbed raw. Those deemed too loud were gagged with rags soaked in vinegar under the guise of calming humors. One nun wrote in her journal that some women seemed to heal after the silence. She added a line a week later, "Others have grown so quiet, we do not know they are still here." Infanticide suspects awaiting trial were often kept in separate quarters, not for protection from them or for them, but to encourage reflection. Reflection meant cold food slid under a door and no candle after dusk. Their names were spoken only in court. In between, they became shadows who pressed hands to walls to feel how far the dark reached. Even birthing rooms could become sites of unspeakable correction. If a midwife believed the mother had conceived out of wedlock, she might allow the labor to stretch long without intervention. No herbs, no massage, no soothing touch. She would mutter about Eve's curse and the wages of sin. The child, if it survived, might be slapped harder than necessary, baptized with colder water than usual, handed over without softness. There was no scroll noting this, only a memory passed into lullabies, warning girls to mind their steps. Sometimes, even writing was complicit. In monastery margins, monks doodled women with swollen bellies and tongues wagging from their mouths, labeled gossips or temptresses. These cartoons offered no names, no dates, but reflected a worldview that punished without trial. Ink became judgment. Scribes who copied sermons into eternal books sometimes slipped in side comments like, "She deserved it." What was it? The woman's body knew. No one else ever would. What punishment cannot be seen becomes hard to name. And what cannot be named cannot be outlawed. Historians, hunting through archives, find only traces. A sudden gap in records. A woman's name crossed out in faded red. A parish ledger noting burial with the words, "No mourners present." We infer violence from absence, reading silence as echo. We count missing daughters, wives, novices, and conclude the ledger lies not through deceit but through indifference. Modernity brought police, hospitals, schools, but many rooms stayed closed. Behind them, new names for old cruelties emerged. Hysteria, discipline, misbehavior, reform. A girl locked in her room for disobedience. A wife prescribed sedatives for nerves. A prisoner found hanging before sunrise. The rooms changed. The silence deepened. What the records don't show is how many women looked at windows, not as light, but as distance. How many learned to cry into sleeves. How many carved initials under wooden cots or sang to themselves so they could hear something kinder than footsteps. These gestures were not documented, but they were real. History is honest about what it can see. But in every archive, there is a second story, the one beneath the ink, behind the door, between the lines. And it waits not to be fully told, perhaps, but to be noticed. Not with applause, not with pity, but with the long, patient gaze that says, I see what was meant to be hidden. I see what the records forgot. Not every punishment drew blood. Some cut deeper by never breaking skin. In medieval towns, ridicule was both tool and punishment designed not to kill, but to wound in ways that laughter made permanent. A woman might survive the whip, but survive a crowd's laughter, echoing through alleys for years, nesting in rhyme and rumor that left bruises even silence couldn't erase. The law knew this and used it. Across Europe, civic codes formalized mockery. In the Netherlands, Kakstraf, cheek punishment, placed offenders in the pillory with signs hung from their necks. Liar, scold, witch, bad wife. These weren't legal terms, but social labels sharpened for memory. People would forget what she stole. They would remember she drooled when she stood locked in stocks, that children smeared lard on her cheeks, that someone put a chamber pot on her head, and the crowd howled. Memory worked like that othered not to fact, but feeling. In England, the cucking stool turned discipline into entertainment. The woman usually accused of gossiping or nagging was wheeled through town in a cart, seated high so her humiliation traveled. One London case describes a baker's wife paraded past her own stall, where apprentices blew kisses and waved stale buns in mock flirtation. The cart paused. She wept. They sang. The judges called it effective. Mockery extended to dress. Sumptuary laws dictated that certain punishments be worn. Donkey ears sewn into caps. Cowbells tied to shoes so each step rang with comic timing. In Avignon, adulteresses were forced to don yellow tunics with phallic patterns stitched crudely across the back. They walked past butchers and bakers whose knives had nicked those same streets earlier in the day, sharp instruments, now dulled by grins and gestures too cruel to count as laughter. France turned mockery into ritual. At Rouen, on the Feast of Fools, a woman convicted of vanity, too much rouge, too much voice might be crowned with thistles and paraded on a donkey facing backward. The donkey wore a mitre. She carried a mirror with her reflection scratched out. Behind her trailed a small boy ringing a bell and shouting her sins in verse. She paints her cheeks. She scorns her lord. She steals the gaze. She mocks the word. It rhymed in French. That was the point. Rhyme mattered. It lasted. In German towns, satirical songs about women who disobeyed husbands became part of guild feasts. Verses cataloged imagined transgressions, burnt stews, lost chickens, rolled eye sand, ended with mock punishments, dunkings, pig rides, pies to the face. Guests roared. Some of the women being mocked sat nearby, smiling tightly, knowing protest would only confirm the joke's target. The songs outlived them, repeated yearly by men who didn't remember the names but knew the tune. Spain formalized satire into public ritual, auto de fe, ceremonies, while grim for heretics often included comic elements for lesser crimes. A woman found guilty of false modesty might be led by a dwarf in bishop's robes, both tied with silk ribbons so tight they had to shuffle together. Crowds laughed, and her punishment was complete before the tribunal spoke. She had become the joke, and once you were the joke, the sentence lasted longer than any prison. Children learned early. In Dutch markets, they sold pastries shaped like shamed women flatbread figures with burnt noses or bent legs. They giggled as they bit off the heads. Parents nodded. This, they thought, was civic education. Sometimes the mockery never touched the guilty. A woman accused of adultery might escape conviction, yet neighbors would mimic her gait, exaggerate her perfume, whistle when she passed. If she glared, she confirmed the suspicion. If she ignored it, she seemed guilty. There was no safe response, no appeal, only exit, and even that just spread her story wider. Mockery leaked beyond punishment into daily life. A woman who dared speak plainly might find her likeness carved on tavern walls, exaggerated hips and snarling mouth scratched beside crude verses. Drunk men would slap the image and laugh. A boy growing up nearby might see that image before he ever heard her voice, and by then, he'd already learned what to believe. But laughter could cut both ways. In secret, women built countersongs. In kitchens, at wells, in threadbare circles by dying firelight, they parodied the parody. One verse mocked a drunk magistrate whose robes stank of fish. Another described an honorable man who cried when his soup was cold. These songs never entered guild books, but they traveled mouth to mouth, daughter to daughter, resistance hidden in rhyme. Sometimes it surfaced. One chronicle tells of a weaver's wife in Krakow who, forced to wear donkey ears, painted them gold and added ribbons. She smiled as she walked. The crowd paused. Confusion cracked the usual script. When a baker mocked her, she kissed his hand and said, "Blessed are the beasts who feed the town." She became a local tale. The laughter that followed her was quieter, less cruel. Not quite admiration, but not mockery either. But those were rare. Most women did not win the joke. Most had to carry its echo, not just for days or years, but forever. Because a mockery once public could cling to you like smoke, hard to scrub, easy to smell. A nickname became an epitaph. A rhyme became a curse you whispered, even as you buried it with the rest of your voice. The law may have lifted its hand, the stocks may have rotted, but the laughter echoed longer, and it still does, sometimes. In cruel nicknames, in whispered jokes at someone's expense, in that flash of amusement when a woman is too loud, too proud, too something, in the smirk that says, "We've seen this before, we know how this ends." And if you listen closely, behind the laughter, you can still hear the pillory creaking, still hear the bell, still hear the rhyme. Cobblestones have long since been paved over, pillories carted to museums, and stocks dissolved into worm-eaten dust. Yet their memory lingers like a low hum beneath modern traffic. Walk any city street, and you can still feel it if you pause. The faint recoil when a woman raises her voice, the quick judgment when she wears a skirt deemed too short, the eager click when gossip headlines dangle scandal. Medieval cruelty hasn't vanished. It has simply traded rope for rumor, scaffold for screen, whip for comment thread. Consider branding. The hot iron is gone, but digital flame burns quicker, leaves marks just as lasting. A photograph shared without consent, a screenshot of private words, a name pushed to the top of search results beside a single ugly label, scandalous, cheater, bad mother. The skin remains unscarred, yet reputation blisters in ways medieval clerks would envy. Once, iron burned one cheek. Now, a viral post circles continents before breath can steady, each retweet a fresh hiss of heat. Public whipping survives in the cadence of online dogpiles. Hundreds rush to strike with sarcasm, gifs, insults never drawing blood, precisely, but measuring impact by trending graphs instead of crimson welts. Spectacle sells. Advertisers perch beside outrage the way bakers once hawked pies near pillories. The market square has become a feed. The crowd still wants a show. The ducking stool? Think of tabloid headlines plunging a celebrity into scandal, pulling her out, gasping for air, dunking again when clicks slow. Each cycle timed by editors the way constables once timed immersions. We keep count, we share the clip, we laugh or shake heads, but rarely ask whether mercy might be more useful than momentum. Shaved heads returned during the 20th century's wars. Women accused of collaboration dragged into squares. Locks shorn while cameras rolled. Today the haircut may be metaphorical contracts canceled, followers lost, brand deals dropped, but hair, real or symbolic, still falls when a woman breaks a rule men neither wrote nor disclosed until after she crossed it. Even the scold's bridle lingers. Online silence is enforced with threats rather than iron. A woman writes an opinion. Replies arrive filled with doxing, rape fantasies, demands she shut up. She deletes her account. The bridle has no spikes, but algorithms note the vacancy like a clapper ringing inside an invisible cage. Pregnancy is sin echoes in state houses where legislators debate how, when, and whether women may manage their own fertility. The words have changed fetal, heartbeat, personhood amendments, but the premise is familiar. A womb belongs partly to public jurisdiction. The punishment may be legal fees, forced travel, denied care rather than branding or stoning, yet it still polices the private with the ferocity of medieval canon law. Mockery too is adapted, wearing the grin of a meme. A manipulated image-open mouth, wide eyes, donkey ears photoshopped and spreads faster than any carnival song. Children once sold pastries shaped like shamed women. Now they remix TikToks, layering dance tracks over courtroom footage, turning pain into punchline for lunchtime views. Home remains a complicated haven. Laws now condemn domestic violence outright, but statistics whisper how often doors still close on cries, no neighbor reports. Police might intervene, yet convictions falter on testimonies blurred by fear, by love, by echoing centuries that taught women bruises should be hidden under sleeves, the way middle-aged wives hid whip stripes beneath wool. The executioner's craft endures in subtler uniforms. Paparazzi, reality TV editors, content moderators deciding which clip stays, which face must endure endless loop. Precision matters, Scott. The frame here. Slow motion. Their pain, delivered clean. Audience satisfied. Advertiser unspooked. The town still pays the headsman. The mask just looks different on camera. And what of children watching? They scroll before bedtime, absorbing shame scripts disguised as entertainment. Prank channels dumping slime on unsuspecting girls. Viral stitches, mocking accents, body shapes, tears. Tiny swipes replace drum beats, but rhythm teaches same lesson. Humiliation is fun, empathy optional. They learn, as their ancestors did, that punishment can taste like candy floss when served with music and laugh track. Yet resistance survives too. Women adapt the old counter songs into hashtags, meet threats with archived receipts, crowdfund lawyers, the way medieval wives brewed salves. Collective voices drown single jeers, just as protest once swarmed scaffolds to halt a flogging mid-stroke. Solidarity writes over history's margin notes, though ink still dries unevenly. Museums display rusted bridles and cracked branding irons behind glass. Visitors peer, shake heads, move on to gift shop. But the guide's commentary often ignores how similar controls persist. We like cruelty best when it feels distant. Safer to condemn a centuries-old lash than confront the lash woven into language, law, habit. Memory matters. Not to wallow, but to recognize patterns. A woman gagged in 1,450 for speaking against a tax. A woman ratioed in 2025 for critiquing a CEO threads, connect them across parchment folds and fiber optic cables. History offers mirror and warning. Whenever society feels unstable, it tightens fists around the same target's voice. Body, sexuality, autonomy hoping order will sprout from bruises. So we end where we began. Punishment is message, pain is pedagogy. The medium evolves, the lesson lingers. If we listen, cobblestones speak, footsteps of women forced to parade, iron scraping wood, laughter swelling, then fading. In the hush that follows, another sound rises, our own devices buzzing, headlines dinging, comment counters ticking upward. The theater is open, the crowd assembled. Question is, will we clap? Will we turn away? Or will we finally dismantle the stage?